The IV line was already dripping when Emily Harlan walked past room 7 and stopped. Something was wrong with the fluid, the color, the viscosity, the way it moved. She had seen that shade exactly once before, in a forward operating base outside Kandahar, 3 seconds before a man's heart stopped in a way no defibrillator could reverse. The patient in room 7 was a 4-star admiral. The man adjusting his IV was the most respected trauma surgeon at Keller Ridge Medical Center. Emily stepped forward. Dr. Marcus Voss turned around slowly, and the look on his face was not the expression of a doctor caught doing something routine. It was the expression of a man calculating how much she had seen. Before this story goes any further, if you've never subscribed to this channel, right now is the moment. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and you won't miss a single story we release. These are the stories that keep you up at night, the ones about ordinary people who turn out to be anything but. Drop a like if you're already hooked, and leave a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far these stories travel. Now, let's go back to Keller Ridge and to a woman nobody at that hospital thought twice about. The first thing anyone noticed about Emily Harlan was that she was quiet. Not shy quiet or nervous quiet, but the kind of quiet that came from someone who had spent a long time learning to take up as little space as possible. She wore her blonde hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to flatten her features, and she moved through the corridors of Keller Ridge Medical Center in Dalton Falls, Colorado, with the posture of a woman trying not to be seen. That was intentional. She had been a nurse at Keller Ridge for 14 months. She worked the evening shift in the medical surgical unit, which meant she spent most of her nights managing post-op patients, charting vitals, fielding call lights, and getting talked over in handoff meetings by charge nurses who had been at the hospital for a decade and treated newer staff like furniture. She did not complain. She did not argue. She answered questions briefly, completed her tasks precisely, and went home to her apartment across town where she lived alone with a second-hand couch, a coffee maker she was genuinely attached to, and a locked steel cabinet in her bedroom closet that she never opened at work. She was 29 years old, and she had not slept a full night in 3 years. The Friday evening that changed everything started like every other Friday evening. She arrived at 6:48 p.m., signed in, pulled her assignment sheet from the rack, and changed into scrubs in the locker room while 2 other nurses, Greta Polone and Sonia Marsh, talked around her as though she were a coat hook. "Did you hear they're putting a VIP in room 7? Greta said, brushing concealer under one eye in the mirror. "VIP as in who?" Sonia asked. "Military. Some kind of high-ranking guy. Rumor is 4 stars. Sonia made a sound of mild interest. "That explains the suits I saw near the elevator." Emily said nothing. She tucked her ID badge into her front pocket and headed out to take report. Room 7 was not on her assignment. She had beds 12 through 19, which kept her on the far end of the hall, away from the private suite near the nurses' station where the VIP was being installed with the kind of quiet efficiency that hospitals reserved for donors and politicians and people whose families might sue. She caught a glimpse through the room's small interior window as she passed. A man in his late 60s, broad-shouldered, even lying down, gray at the temples, with the particular stillness of someone who was used to being observed. 2 men in dark suits stood near the wall. A third was speaking quietly with Dr. Marcus Voss, who was nodding in the measured, authoritative way he always nodded when he wanted everyone in the room to know that he was the most important medical mind present. Emily knew Voss the way you came to know anyone you worked adjacent to for over a year, by pattern. He arrived at 7 a.m. regardless of shift. He took his coffee black. He called nurses by their last names except when he wanted something done faster, at which point he used first names with a kind of practiced warmth that made the request feel like a privilege. He was brilliant in a way that required witnesses to fully appreciate, and he made certain witnesses were always available. He had privileges at 3 hospitals in the county, 2 published papers framed in his office, and the kind of face that appeared in the hospital's annual report. Emily had never liked him. She had never said so. She moved on to her assignment and spent the next 2 hours doing what she always did: checks, charting, a bag change in 14, a blood pressure recheck in 17, a patient in 16 who could not stop apologizing for needing help walking to the bathroom and whom she told, with the first genuine warmth she had displayed all shift, that needing help was not something anyone should apologize for. At 9:15 p.m., she was returning a supply cart to the equipment alcove near the nurse's station when she passed room 7 again. The door was cracked open 6 inches. She did not intend to look. She looked anyway. Voss was alone with the Admiral. The suits were gone, probably a shift change or a bathroom break, or someone had made a coffee run. The Admiral was awake but drowsy in the way of someone on light sedation, his head tilted slightly toward the window, one arm resting at his side with an IV line running into the back of his hand. Voss was standing beside the IV stand, doing something to the drip chamber with the particular economy of motion that characterized people who performed physical tasks so regularly they no longer thought about them. Emily slowed without deciding to. The light in the room was yellow and institutional, but there was enough of it, and she was close enough to the crack in the door that she could see the bag clearly. The fluid in the lower tubing, the section between the drip chamber and the cannula, had a quality that made her stop breathing for approximately half a second. She had seen it before. Not at Keller Ridge, not in any civilian setting. She had seen it in a forward operating base in a country whose name she did not say out loud anymore, during a 9-month classified deployment that did not appear on any resume she had ever submitted. The solution had been introduced into a unit's water supply. 2 soldiers had died before anyone identified what it was. The third survived only because someone with the right knowledge had moved fast enough to pull the line. Emily was already pushing the door open. Voss turned. His expression went through 3 changes in under a second: surprise, calculation, and then the smooth professional reset that she suspected was automatic by now. "Harlan," he said, "this isn't your patient. What's in the IV?" He blinked, and the blink lasted a fraction too long. "Saline with potassium. He's depleted. What are you—" "That's not what that looks like." The words came out flat and precise, and she watched him make a decision in real time. He stepped slightly to the left, positioning himself between her and the IV stand with the casualness of a man adjusting his footing, and he smiled the way he always smiled when he wanted something to feel resolved. "You're confused," he said. "You've had a long shift. Why don't you—" Emily walked past him and reached for the IV line. His hand closed around her wrist. "Do not touch that," he said, and this time the warmth was entirely gone, and what replaced it was something she recognized from a different context. The voice of a person who was accustomed to issuing commands that were obeyed. She looked at his hand on her wrist. Then she looked at him. "Let go," she said. He did not let go. He stepped closer, which brought him 2 inches from her face, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to a register that would not carry past the door. "You're a floor nurse. You've been here 14 months. I've been practicing medicine for 22 years. Walk away, and this doesn't have to turn into anything." Emily pulled her wrist free, reached past him, and yanked the IV line out of the cannula in the Admiral's hand. The Admiral startled awake. "What?" "Sir, I need you to stay still," Emily said. She was already looking at the line, holding it close to the overhead light, examining the fluid. "Can you tell me if you felt anything unusual in the last few minutes? Chest tightness, difficulty breathing, warmth in your arm?" The Admiral stared at her. He was more alert than she'd expected, his eyes focusing with the speed of a man trained to come to attention quickly, regardless of what had preceded it. "Some tightness," he said. "I thought it was from the position." "How long?" 8, maybe 10 minutes. Emily turned to the IV stand and disconnected the bag entirely. Voss grabbed her arm again, harder this time. "Security," he said loudly. "Security to room 7. "Let go of my arm or I will break your wrist," Emily said. She said it with the same tone she'd used when telling the patient in 16 not to apologize, which was the tone of someone who was simply stating a fact that would be true, regardless of whether the listener believed it. He let go. The Admiral had pushed himself upright in the bed. He was watching Emily with an expression she couldn't quite read. It wasn't alarm, exactly. It was something more like recognition, as though he was recalibrating a first impression at speed. "Who are you?" he asked. "Emily Harlan. I work the med-surg floor." She set the IV bag on the windowsill and looked him in the eye. "I need to know if you have any known medication sensitivities, or if you've recently been in contact with anyone who had access to your care schedule before today." The Admiral opened his mouth. The door swung open and 2 security guards filled the frame, followed by the charge nurse on duty, Deborah Weil, who had been at Keller Ridge for 11 years and who looked at Emily the way a homeowner looks at a very small dog, that has somehow gotten into the living room. Harlan, Deborah said, step away from the patient. I need this IV bag sent to the lab, Emily said. I believe it's been compromised. Step away from the patient. Emily did not step away. She held up the bag. Look at the viscosity. Look at the color of the tubing near the chamber. That is not standard potassium solution. Deborah glanced at the bag with the brief, confident assessment of someone who had already decided what was in it. That's a potassium drip. Dr. Voss ordered it. I know what Dr. Voss ordered. I'm telling you what's in the line. Harlan, Deborah walked into the room. You have no authority to make that determination. You pulled a line from a critical patient without physician approval, without a documented order, without... His OSAT is dropping, Emily said, because she had been watching the monitor on the wall and the number had moved from 97 to 94 since she'd walked in. Everyone looked at the monitor, even Voss looked. 94. Then 93. That's not... Voss started. Whatever was in the line was already absorbed, Emily said. She looked at the Admiral. I need you to cough. Forcefully. Can you do that? The Admiral, to his considerable credit, did not ask why. He coughed 3 times, hard and deliberate. Keep going, Emily said. He kept going. She watched the monitor. 93. 92. 91. Get a crash cart, she said. Nobody is getting a crash cart based on her assessment, Voss said. She's a floor nurse who pulled an IV without authorization and is now manufacturing a crisis to 90. The monitor alarm activated. Deborah went pale. Call the rapid response team, she said to one of the security guards, who immediately turned and went for the door. Voss moved toward the patient and Emily blocked him without thinking about it, putting her body between him and the bed in a way that caused him to stop short and stare at her as though she had spoken in a language he didn't have. Move, he said. You're not touching him, Emily said. I am his physician. You're the one who changed the IV. The room went quiet, in the way of rooms where something has just been said that cannot be walked back. Voss's expression shifted. She watched it move through 3 separate calculations, and what settled on his face at the end of them was not anger. It was something colder and more controlled than anger, and Emily had seen that expression before too, in a different country, on the face of a man who had just realized he needed to change his exit plan. The monitor dropped to 88. I need positioning, Emily said, because positioning mattered when systemic absorption was already underway, and what she needed was to buy time for whatever the compound was, to either dissipate or metabolize past the point of lethality. She needed him sitting upright. She needed supplemental oxygen. She grabbed the oxygen mask from the wall bracket, untangled the line from the cylinder, and fitted it over the Admiral's nose and mouth herself. In through the nose, she said, slow and deliberate. Don't fight it. He nodded once and breathed. The monitor held at 88, then climbed 1 point, then another. The rapid response team arrived at 9:26 p.m., 2 nurses and a respiratory therapist, pushing the cart through the doorway with the controlled urgency of people who had done this enough times that it no longer produced adrenaline. The attending physician on call, Dr. Gary Osei, came in 30 seconds behind them and took in the scene. The unplugged IV stand, the bag on the windowsill, Voss standing against the wall with his arms crossed, Emily beside the bed with her hand on the Admiral's shoulder, the monitor showing 89 and climbing. What happened? Osei said. She pulled his line, Voss said. I pulled his line, Emily confirmed. I believe the IV solution was chemically altered. His oxygen saturation was dropping on supplemental flow and has partially recovered since removal and repositioning. I'd recommend arterial blood gas, immediate toxicology on the bag and on his blood, and a cardio consult before anything else is introduced into that line. Osei looked at her for a moment that was a fraction too long for a routine handoff. Your name? He said. Harlan. Emily Harlan. Med-Surg, beds 12 through 19. He looked at the monitor. He looked at the IV bag on the windowsill. He looked at Voss. Voss said, This is an overreaction to a coincidental dip in saturation. She had no business being in this room, and she had no authority to interfere with my patient's care. Get the bag to the lab, Osei said to one of the rapid response nurses. Full panel. Flag it urgent. He turned to the respiratory therapist. Let's get a proper mask on him and pull a blood gas. He did not address Voss again, which was, Emily thought, its own kind of statement. She stepped back from the bed. The room was crowded now. 4 people around the Admiral, 1 nurse documenting on a tablet, Ose pulling on gloves. She was no longer needed here, and she knew it, and she began moving toward the door. Deborah was waiting for her in the hallway. "My office," Deborah said. "Now." The meeting was 12 minutes long. Emily sat in the chair across from Deborah's desk and did not speak unless asked a direct question, which was a habit she had developed in environments where every word was evidence of something. Deborah spoke for most of the 12 minutes. She covered unauthorized interference with a physician's care plan, abandonment of assigned patients, failure to follow chain of command, disruptive behavior in a critical care environment, and something she called erosion of team trust that Emily suspected was a phrase from a policy manual. At the end of it, Deborah set a single sheet of paper on the desk and pushed it across. "I need you to sign the acknowledgement," she said. "This is a formal counseling record. One more incident at this severity and we move to termination." Emily looked at the paper. She thought about what was in that IV bag. She thought about the man in room 7 and the color of the fluid in that line, and the sound of a heart monitor dropping in a way that was not the sound of natural deterioration. She thought about another room in another country, and a man she had not been fast enough to reach, and the weight of that failure that she had carried for 3 years like a stone in her chest. She picked up the pen and signed the acknowledgement. She went back to her shift, and she did not leave until 7:15 a.m., and she was in the middle of giving report to the incoming day nurse when her phone buzzed with a text from an extension she didn't recognize. "Harlan, HR, 8 a.m. Bring your badge." She finished report. She went to HR at 8 o'clock, and the meeting lasted 4 minutes, and at the end of it she handed over her badge and her access card and her parking permit and walked out of Keller Ridge Medical Center into a gray Saturday morning with nothing but her bag and her keys and the very specific, very controlled anger of a person who has learned to wait. The parking lot was quiet at that hour. A few early arrivals moving between their cars and the entrance, a facilities truck idling near the dumpsters. Emily walked to her car, a 9-year-old gray sedan that she kept meticulously clean, and she was putting her key in the door when she heard it. 3 vehicles, coming fast from the direction of the main road, not from the hospital entrance. The sound of tires on asphalt at a speed that didn't belong in a hospital parking lot at 8:15 a.m. She looked up. 3 black SUVs moved in formation into the lot and stopped in a hard line near the main entrance. The doors opened simultaneously. 4 people from the first vehicle, 3 from the second, 2 from the third, and they moved with a particular efficiency that she recognized before she could articulate what she was recognizing, the way you recognized a smell from years ago before your brain caught up with the identification. Military, or federal, or both. They were in civilian clothes, but the way they held themselves was not civilian, and the way they cleared the space around the entrance without appearing to was the movement of people who had trained for it. One of them, a woman, mid-40s, dark coat, close-cropped hair, stopped at the edge of the lot and looked directly at Emily. Emily did not move. The woman began walking toward her. She stopped 6 feet away and looked at Emily with an expression that was not unfriendly and was not warm and was entirely focused. "Emily Harlan," the woman said. "Formerly Staff Sergeant Emily Harlan, 3rd Medical Brigade, classified deployment, separated from service 3 years and 2 months ago." Emily said nothing. "My name is Special Agent Nora Veltri, Defense Criminal Investigative Service." She produced credentials and held them where Emily could see them clearly. "We've been aware of your location for approximately 8 months. We've been deciding whether to make contact." Emily looked at the credentials. She looked at Veltri. "What changed?" she said. Veltri glanced toward the hospital entrance, where 2 of the other agents were now speaking with the security guard at the door. "What changed," Veltri said, "is that the man in room 7 is the only living witness to something we've been building a case around for 4 years. And last night, someone tried to kill him in a way that required specific knowledge of a compound that is not commercially available, is not in any civilian medical literature, and has appeared exactly twice before, both times in connection with the same classified operation that ended your military career." Emily felt the stone in her chest shift. "And you need me because," she said, "because you're the only person outside of a classified file who recognized it in time," Veltri said, "and because the man who administered it has been at this hospital for 11 months, and we need to know what else he's had access to." Behind Veltri, one of the agents near the entrance was speaking into a radio with the clipped urgency of someone delivering information that was changing something. Then the agent turned and signaled to Veltri with a single raised hand. Veltri's face changed. "Voss," she said, and it came out flat and fast. "What about him?" Emily said. "He's gone," the agent called across the lot. "Room was empty when they went back in. He changed out of his coat before we locked the building down. Someone let him through the staff exit." Emily was already turning back toward the hospital entrance. "Harlan," Veltri said. "He didn't finish," Emily said. "He won't leave without finishing. We have agents inside to—" "He knows this building better than your agents do," Emily said. "He's been here 11 months. He knows every exit, every blind spot, every room that doesn't have a camera." She looked at Veltri. "And the Admiral is still in room 7. Veltri held her gaze for exactly 1 second. "Move," she said. They moved. They went through the main entrance at a pace that wasn't quite running but covered ground. The way running did. Veltri 2 steps ahead and already speaking into the radio clipped to her lapel, Emily just behind her with the particular focus of someone who had stopped processing fear as a separate sensation from information. The lobby was wrong immediately. Not chaotic, that would have been easier to read. It was too still, the kind of still that happened when people who worked in a building every day sensed that something had changed in the building's atmosphere and didn't yet know what it meant. The woman at the information desk had her phone to her ear and was watching the elevator bank. A man in a hospital gown who'd been walking the lobby circuit with his IV pole had stopped near the window and was staring at the agents moving through the glass doors. Veltri pointed 2 agents toward the stairwell on the left and directed 2 more toward the elevator corridor without breaking stride. "Nobody uses the staff exit on sub-level 2 until it's confirmed clear," she said into the radio. "I want someone physically on that door, not monitoring it, on it." "He has 11 months of access," Emily said. "He'll know which cameras have the worst angles." "There's a corridor on the 2nd floor that connects the surgical suite to the old imaging wing. It's a legacy layout from when the building was expanded. Half the staff don't know it exists." Veltri looked at her sideways as they moved toward the elevator. "You've been here 14 months. "I walk when I can't sleep," Emily said. "I know the building." Veltri made a decision in about a second. "Take me there." The elevator was occupied by 2 orderlies with a transport gurney, so they took the stairs, and Emily moved up them 2 at a time with the efficiency of someone whose body remembered doing this in heavier gear. And she didn't think about that because thinking about it wasn't useful right now. What was useful was the layout of the 2nd floor, which she had in her head the way she had a lot of things she'd never intended to memorize, but had anyway, because her brain had been wired for a long time to treat her physical environment as a tactical problem. The 2nd floor smelled like antiseptic and floor wax, and the particular recycled air quality of a building that had been sealed against the November cold. The main corridor was bright and occupied. A nurse pushing a medication cart, 2 visitors looking at room numbers on their phones, a housekeeper with a mop bucket near the far end. Normal. Pointed in ordinary directions. The connecting corridor was different. It branched off from the main hall at an angle that was easy to miss if you weren't looking for it, marked only with a sign that said Imaging West, authorized personnel. The lettering faded and the sign itself slightly tilted, which was the kind of maintenance detail that happened in sections of a building nobody prioritized. The fluorescent light overhead was dimmer than the main corridor, one of the tubes flickering every 15 seconds or so with the patience of something that had been reporting a problem for months and had been ignored. Emily stopped at the entrance to the corridor and listened. She heard footsteps. Soft, deliberate, the footsteps of someone who was moving carefully rather than moving fast, which told her something about where they were going. You moved fast when you were running, you moved carefully when you were navigating towards something specific. She held up one hand and Veltri stopped. The corridor ran approximately 40 feet and then turned left toward the old imaging suite, which had been largely decommissioned 3 years ago when the hospital moved to a newer radiology setup on the 3rd floor. Most of the old equipment was still in place. Nobody had budgeted for removal, which meant the rooms back there had become the informal storage overflow for the departments on either side, and they were visited infrequently enough that a person who knew the layout could stand in one of them for a considerable amount of time without anyone coming past, or use them to move between one part of the building and another without appearing on a camera. Emily looked at Veltri and pointed to herself, then to the corridor, then held up two fingers and pointed to the left branch. Someone's already in there. Second position, left side. Veltry's expression said she wasn't entirely comfortable taking tactical direction from a floor nurse she'd met 7 minutes ago in a parking lot, but she also wasn't about to argue with the assessment of someone who'd been right once already tonight. So she gave a single nod and drew her sidearm and positioned herself at the right edge of the corridor entrance. Emily didn't have a sidearm. She had her bag, which she'd been carrying since she left HR, and which contained her phone, her car keys, a granola bar she'd been meaning to eat for 4 hours, and a compact flashlight that she clipped to her belt because she'd found it useful on night shifts when checking pupils or reading labels in dim storage rooms. She unclipped it now, turned it off, and held it in her right hand. She moved into the corridor. The flickering tube overhead strobed her shadow forward and back in a rhythm that was disorienting if you let it be, so she didn't let it be. She stayed close to the left wall where the shadow coverage was better, and she placed her feet carefully on the linoleum because linoleum carried sound differently than tile, and she'd learned that distinction in a context she didn't revisit. 15 feet in, she could hear breathing, shallow and controlled, the breathing of someone who was managing their own anxiety rather than someone who was calm. That distinction also mattered. She was 5 feet from the turn when a hand came around the corner and seized her by the front of her scrub top. She let the forward momentum go rather than fighting it, fell into the pull instead of against it, which was counterintuitive enough that the person holding her lost a fraction of a second recalibrating, and she brought her right arm up inside the grip and broke the hold at the wrist and spun herself to the right in a single continuous motion that put her behind and to the side of the person who had grabbed her. Dr. Marcus Voss stumbled forward a step, caught himself against the wall, and turned. He looked different without the white coat. He was wearing scrubs. Not his scrubs. They were a different color than what he'd had on in room 7, light blue instead of the dark navy the surgical staff wore, and they were slightly too short in the leg, which meant he'd grabbed them off a shelf or from a locker that wasn't his. His face was not panicked. It was tightly controlled and deliberately expressionless in a way that was its own kind of tell, the face of a person running an internal calculus rather than reacting. "Harlan," he said. "Where are you going?" she said. He looked at the flashlight in her hand. "You going to hit me with that?" "I haven't decided yet." Behind her, she heard Veltry coming around the corner, and she heard the sound that followed, the particular quality of air movement when someone raises a firearm. And Voss heard it too, because his eyes went to a point past Emily's shoulder, and whatever calculation he was running came up with a new variable. "Marcus Voss," Veltry said, "do not move. Keep your hands visible." He kept his hands visible. He looked at Emily with something in his face that she couldn't name precisely. It wasn't quite contempt, it wasn't quite fear, it was closer to the expression of a chess player who had just seen an opponent make a move that was better than expected and was updating their assessment of the board. "You moved faster than I thought you would," he said. "People usually do when someone's trying to kill them," Emily said. "I wasn't trying to kill you." "You were trying to kill him." He said nothing. "Down on the ground," Veltry said. "Now, hands behind your head." Voss got on the ground. Not quickly, with the slow, deliberate compliance of someone who was performing cooperation rather than experiencing it, every movement saying, "I am doing this under protest, and I am documenting that protest internally." Veltry was on him in 4 seconds, and she had cuffs on him in 3 more, and she was already on the radio calling the others in while Voss lay on the linoleum with his cheek against the floor and stared at a point somewhere near the baseboard. Emily leaned against the wall and exhaled for the first time in what felt like several minutes. Her hands were steady. They were always steady during. It was after that they shook, a delayed reaction that she'd learned to account for, and she had approximately 10 minutes before it started, which meant she needed to use those 10 minutes productively. She looked at Voss. "Is there anything else in the hospital that I need to know about?" He didn't answer. "Marcus." She said it without inflection. "If there's a secondary measure and the Admiral's saturation drops again before your people find it, that's a murder charge instead of attempted. That's a different sentence." He looked at her. Something shifted in his face, not remorse exactly, but the arithmetic of self-interest reaching a conclusion. "The call button panel," he said. "Room 7. I replaced the button housing 2 weeks ago. There's a secondary line that goes into the room's oxygen supply. It's not connected to anything yet. I hadn't completed the installation." Emily was already moving back toward the main corridor. She heard Veltri behind her. "Harlan, wait for the team. Don't—" And she kept moving because she had told Veltri the truth. She knew this building, and she could get to room 7 in less time than it would take to relay the information and wait for someone else to act on it. And time was the one variable she could not negotiate with. She went back to the stairwell, up one floor, down the main corridor to room 7, and she knocked once and pushed the door open. The room was occupied. 2 agents were already inside, stationed after the breach in the parking lot, apparently. And the Admiral was sitting up in the bed with the oxygen mask pushed to one side and the alert, evaluating expression of someone who had been through enough situations in his life that being surrounded by armed people in a hospital room was unusual but not paralyzing. "The call button housing," Emily said to the near agent. "He said there's a secondary line running to the oxygen supply. You need to pull that panel." The agent looked at her with the particular expression that people who had credentials tended to direct at people who didn't. "And you are?" he said. "The person who pulled his IV last night and is now telling you to pull the panel," Emily said. "You can verify my credentials or you can check the panel. Your choice." He checked the panel. Behind the call button housing, a standard white plastic casing that matched the ones in every other room in the hospital. There was a secondary port that shouldn't have been there, connected by a thin silicone tube that ran up through the wall cavity and joined the room's oxygen supply line 2 feet above the outlet. The tube was empty. Voss had been telling the truth about the installation being incomplete. The agent pulled it. The Admiral watched the whole thing and then looked at Emily. "You work here?" he said. "Not anymore," she said. His eyes didn't change expression, but something in them did. A minor recalibration. "What's your name?" "Emily Harlan." "What was your MOS?" She looked at him. He was using military occupational specialty terminology, which meant he either knew what he was looking at or was very good at reading people, and given that he had 4 stars, she suspected it was both. "Why does that matter right now, sir?" she said. "It doesn't," he said. I'm asking anyway." She was quiet for a moment. 68 whiskey, she said. "With additional qualifications I'm not going to list in a hospital room." He nodded slowly, like someone confirming a thing they had already suspected. "You're the one who pulled the line." "Yes." "And you were fired for it." "This morning, about 40 minutes ago." He didn't say anything to that, but the look on his face was a specific kind of look. Not sympathetic exactly, more like the expression of someone filing a piece of information in a place where it would be accessible later. The agent who had pulled the panel was on his radio, and through the window in the room's door, Emily could see additional personnel moving in the corridor with the purposeful speed of an operation shifting into a new phase. 2 men in what looked like plainclothes FBI, a woman with a laptop bag who moved like she was en route to a command position, a hospital administrator. She thought it was the deputy COO, a man named Garrett Fells, walking rapidly with his phone pressed to his ear and his face doing the particular contortion of someone receiving information that was significantly worse than what he'd expected. Veltri appeared in the doorway. She looked at Emily. She looked at the panel. She looked at the Admiral. "He's secure," she said. "We're processing him at the field office. We'll need a statement from you this morning." "I know," Emily said. "We'll also need your full background. The classified file, not the redacted version that you submitted to the hospital." "I know that too." Veltri studied her for a moment. "How long have you been in Dalton Falls?" 14 months. "Why here?" Emily looked at the window. Gray morning light was making its way through the blinds in thin horizontal lines. "It's small enough that nobody looks too hard," she said, "and it has a hospital. You could have worked anywhere." "I wanted somewhere quiet." Veltri made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite skepticism. "That's done now." Emily knew it was. She had known it from the moment she'd pulled the IV line, or maybe earlier. Maybe from the moment she'd stopped in the corridor and looked through the crack in the door and seen the color of that fluid, and felt the recognition move through her like a current, the thing she'd spent 3 years trying to make go quiet, rising up with such complete clarity that she hadn't had time to talk herself out of it. Quiet was done. She'd known that in room 7 before she'd admitted it to herself. The next 4 hours were not quiet. Dalton Falls was a town of 50,000 in a mountain county that had 3 traffic lights on the main corridor and a newspaper that came out twice a week, and a population that treated significant events with a certain brisk frontier pragmatism. You dealt with the thing. You talked about it later. You didn't stop moving. The hospital had been a major employer since the 1970s, and the appearance of 9 federal vehicles in the parking lot of Keller Ridge Medical Center at 8 o'clock on a Saturday morning was, by the standards of Dalton Falls, approximately a 9 on a 10-point scale of significant events. By 9 a.m., the news had reached the coffee shop on Main Street. By 9:30, it had reached the county sheriff's office, which dispatched 2 deputies to the hospital. Not because they had jurisdiction over whatever was happening, but because the sheriff, a woman named Paula Erck, had learned over 15 years in office that it was better to be at a federal event than to hear about it later from someone who'd been there. Emily spent those hours in a conference room on the administrative floor that had been commandeered by Veltri's team, who had produced laptops and document cases and secure phones with an efficiency that suggested they'd been prepared to set up quickly. She sat across a table from Veltri and a second agent, a compact man named Rowan Dupree, who had a voice that was slightly too soft for his size and who asked questions the way experienced investigators ask questions. Not in a straight line, but in overlapping circles, returning to the same territory from different angles to see if the answer shifted. It didn't shift. Emily had spent enough time in debrief environments to understand what was being checked, and she answered what she could answer, declined to speculate where she couldn't, and corrected herself twice when she'd given an approximation that on reflection was imprecise. Dupree noted the corrections without comment, which told her he'd noticed them and was evaluating them positively, which told her he was good at his job. Veltri took point on the classified background portion. She pulled a file, a physical file, which was unusual and indicated the sensitivity level of its contents, and set it open on the table and asked Emily to confirm specific operational details that Emily had not discussed with anyone since her separation from service. The particulars of the compound, the 2 previous incidents, the forward operating base designation, the name of the commanding officer who had been present at the second incident and who had died 6 months after Emily's discharge under circumstances that were listed in official records as a training accident and which Emily had never in 3 years believed were a training accident. She said that to Veltri plainly and watched Veltri's expression not change. "We know," Veltri said. Emily waited. "Major Daniel Fry," Veltri said. "His death is part of what we're investigating, has been for 2 years." She paused. "He knew what was in that compound. I was going to testify about it." Emily looked at the table. She breathed once, evenly, through her nose. "Who else?" she said. "In my unit." Veltri glanced at Dupree. Something passed between them that Emily read correctly. "How many?" Emily said. "We believe 4 of the 7 deaths from your unit in the 3 years since deployment ended were connected," Veltri said. "All listed as accidents or natural causes. The investigation is ongoing." The room was very quiet. Emily had known some of this. Not the specifics, not 4, not the 2-year investigation, but she had known in the way that you knew things you couldn't prove and couldn't report and couldn't grieve properly because grieving them meant accepting that you hadn't just lost friends. You'd lost them deliberately, and that was a kind of knowledge that was very difficult to live inside. "And Voss," she said. "How long has he been connected to this?" 11 months at the hospital, Dupree said. "But we believe his involvement goes back further. He was a contractor-affiliated physician at a defense medicine facility during the period of your deployment. He would have had access to the compound's composition through legitimate channels." "He knew what it would look like on a talk screen," Emily said. It wasn't a question. She'd been working it through since the parking lot. "Which is why it's been used successfully before," Dupree said. "To someone without your specific experience, the presentation would look like a cardiac event in a high-risk patient. Plausible, clean." Emily thought about the flickering light in the imaging corridor. She thought about Voss on the floor, his cheek against the linoleum, running calculations. "Who sent him here?" she said. Veltri began to answer. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen and her expression shifted in a way that Emily, who had been reading faces for 14 months in a hospital environment where emotional transparency was considered unprofessional, caught immediately. "What?" Emily said. Veltri turned the phone slightly so Emily could see the screen. It was a message from one of the other agents. Short, relayed from the processing location where Voss was being held. 4 words. "He's asking for immunity." Emily looked at it. "He'll give up the network," Dupree said. That's what this is. He's calculating his odds and deciding that cooperation is better than a full charge without leverage. Can you give it to him? Emily said. That's above my pay grade, Dupree said. That goes to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Veltri was already on a second phone, speaking quietly. Emily watched her through the glass wall of the conference room, watched the way her jaw set, watched the small, decisive head movement that meant she was being told something she was absorbing rather than agreeing with. Below the administrative floor, the hospital was continuing to function. Patients were being fed breakfast. Shift change had happened. Someone in the surgical unit was probably updating a whiteboard. The world had a remarkable capacity to keep being mundane alongside the extraordinary, and Emily had spent 3 years using that fact as cover. She looked at her own hands on the table. Steady, still. The post-adrenaline shake had come and gone, sometime in the second hour, quietly, while she was talking, the way it always did. She was very tired. Not physically, or not only physically. The kind of tired that came from carrying something heavy for long enough that you forgot it was there until you set it down and felt the absence of the weight, and then you felt how long you'd been carrying it. Veltri came back in and sat down. The U.S. Attorney's Office has been briefed, she said. They're sending a representative. We'll hold the immunity discussion until they're on site, which means we're looking at early afternoon before we have anything definitive. Emily nodded. In the meantime, Veltri said, there's something else. The lab results from the IV bag came back about an hour ago. Emily already knew what the compound was. She waited. The composition matches what was used in the second incident from your deployment, Veltri said. Specifically, it's not a derivative or a modified version, it's the same formulation. Which means it came from the same source, Emily said. Or someone with direct access to the original synthesis, Dupree said. Who's still active? Emily said. Neither of them answered, which was an answer. Emily pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of her nose and held them there for a moment. She was thinking about chains, the specific logic of how a compound that was classified moved from a military installation to a hospital room in Dalton Falls, Colorado, and how many links were in that chain, and how many of those links were still functional, and what happened if Voss decided that immunity wasn't worth the exposure and changed his mind. She was thinking about Daniel Fry, who had briefed his unit on the compound's mechanism because he believed his people deserved to understand what they might encounter, and who had died 2 years after the deployment ended in a training accident that nobody in Emily's unit had believed, and whose death she had reported exactly nowhere because she had no evidence and no standing and no way to make herself heard. She was thinking about a specific afternoon, autumn, the light going gold and flat the way it did in October, when she'd walked out of a base medical facility with separation papers and a handshake from a colonel she'd never met before and would not see again, and had gotten into a taxi and looked out the window at the gate receding behind her and thought, that's it. That's all that was. The Admiral, she said. He's stable? Recovering, Veltri said. The attending has him on monitoring, but his vitals have been consistent for the past 3 hours. Whatever was in the line didn't have long enough to fully absorb. Emily thought about the 8 minutes the Admiral had said he'd felt tightness. She thought about the margin. I need coffee, she said. Dupree stood. I'll get it. How do you take it? Black, she said. Please. He went out and Veltri looked at Emily across the table with an expression that was evaluating something. Emily waited. The hospital fired you this morning, Veltri said. Correct. Before the lab results came back. Correct. Based on Dr. Voss's account of the incident and the charge nurse's report. That's what I assume. Veltri tapped the edge of the file folder with one finger, a slow rhythm that didn't seem to match anything else about her energy. The hospital administration is currently having a very difficult morning, she said. The deputy COO has been in a meeting with our team for the last hour. There are questions about how Voss obtained his privileges here, who verified his credentials, and whether anyone at the administrative level had any awareness of what was happening. Emily said nothing. We're not done pulling that thread, Veltri said. How far do you think it goes? Emily said. Veltri stopped tapping. I don't know yet, she said. That's what makes it interesting. Dupree returned with coffee and a paper cup that had the Keller Ridge Administrative Floors logo on the side, which Emily found mildly surreal. The institution that had fired her 4 hours ago was now providing her coffee in a room where federal agents were investigating what had been happening inside it. She drank the coffee and didn't think too hard about the symbolism. The morning moved. Agents came and went from the conference room. Documents were photographed and cataloged. At some point, someone brought in a box of packaged crackers and cheese from the third-floor vending machine and set it on the table, and nobody acknowledged it, but everyone ate from it. At 11:47, Dupree's phone rang. He listened for 12 seconds. He looked at Veltri. "Voss changed his statement," he said. Veltri went still. "He's no longer requesting immunity," Dupree said. "He's requesting a specific attorney, private, not a public defender." He paused. "And he's rescinded everything he said in the corridor about the call button panel. He's saying it was coerced." Emily set down her paper cup. "He got a message," Veltri said. It wasn't a question. "Somebody got to him through the processing chain," Dupree said. "We're trying to identify who, but if he recants the panel statement," Emily said, "what happens to the physical evidence?" Veltri looked at her. "The panel itself is already logged and photographed. The secondary tube is in evidence. His statement is one layer. The physical evidence stands independent of it." "But his cooperation is gone," Emily said. "His cooperation is gone," Veltri confirmed. The room was quiet for a moment. "Which means whoever sent him," Emily said, "they're still reachable from outside this building. They have access to the processing chain. They knew where he was being held and had enough of an asset in place to get a message through in under 3 hours." Veltri and Dupree exchanged a look. "That's a sophisticated network," Emily said. "Yes," Veltri said, "with people still in place." "Yes." Emily thought about the Admiral in room 7, stable and monitored, with agents on the door. She thought about 4 deaths from her unit in 3 years. She thought about Daniel Fry's name in a classified file and what it had looked like to see it confirmed in print for the first time. She thought about the fact that Voss had smiled, small, composed, the smile of a man whose position had just been shored up from the outside, and said he had changed his mind, and the people who had sent him the message that made him change his mind were still, right now, in the world, looking at what had happened in Dalton Falls and deciding what to do next. Her phone buzzed on the table. Unknown number, local area code. She looked at Veltri, who nodded. Emily answered. Silence on the line for 3 seconds. Then a voice. Male, unhurried, with the particular flatness of someone who had learned to remove affect from their speech. "Staff Sergeant Harlan," the voice said. "You've had a busy morning." Emily's hand on the phone was steady. "You should know," the voice continued, "that Dr. Voss was not the principal. He was one component, and components can be replaced." "Who is this?" Emily said. "Someone who wants you to understand the scope of what you've walked into," the voice said, "and to make a decision about whether you want to keep walking." The line went dead. Emily set the phone on the table. Veltri was already on her feet. "We can trace the burner," Emily said. "It'll be a burner." She looked at the phone on the table, then at Veltri. "They know I'm here. They know I talked to you. They know what I told you." Veltri didn't deny it. "How?" Emily said. "Who's inside this investigation?" And that was when the door opened, and the agent standing in the doorway had an expression that was not good, and what he said next made Veltri close her eyes for exactly half a second. "We found something in the hospital's financial records," the agent said. "The past 18 months of administrative approvals." He held up a tablet. "Voss wasn't credentialed by accident. Someone on the inside of this hospital signed off on his privileges." He turned the tablet so the room could see the name on the screen. Emily looked at it. She recognized the name. Not from the hospital. Not from 14 months of working the med-surg floor. From a briefing document she'd been handed in a forward operating base 7 years ago, in a country she didn't name, on an operation she wasn't supposed to remember. The name on the tablet was Garrett Fells. Emily had seen it in a single paragraph of a mission briefing document, a contractor liaison list, the kind of administrative attachment that got stapled to the back of operational orders, and that most people skimmed or skipped entirely. She had read it because she read everything, a habit from a childhood spent in a house where information was the only currency that didn't run out. And the name had stayed in her memory the way names sometimes did when they appeared in a context that felt slightly wrong without being obviously wrong. Garrett Fells, Defense Procurement Liaison, attached to the Forward Logistics Network supporting her unit's operational theater, a civilian name in a military document, an administrative function in an operational context. She had thought about it for approximately 30 seconds in a briefing room 7 years ago and then moved on. She was thinking about it now. "He's the deputy COO, Emily said. "He's been here since before I started." 11 years, the agent in the doorway confirmed. He stepped fully into the room and set the tablet on the table. He signed off on Voss's credentialing application 14 months ago, bypassed the standard verification committee, listed it as an emergency hire under the trauma coverage protocol, which gives the COO's office authority to fast-track privileges when the surgical roster is under capacity. Was the roster under capacity? Veltri asked. By one surgeon, marginally, within the range where the protocol technically applies, but normally wouldn't be invoked. The agent turned the tablet so the full document was visible. The application was submitted on a Thursday evening, approved by Fells on Friday morning. Credentialing committee never saw it. Emily looked at the document. It was a standard hospital credentialing form, the kind she'd seen on bulletin boards and in policy binders throughout her time on the floor. Voss's name, his professional history, his licensing information. All of it clean, all of it plausible. The paperwork of a person who had constructed a legitimate surface with considerable care. And at the bottom, Garrett Fells's signature. Dated 14 months ago, 3 days before Emily's own start date. She thought about the timeline, Voss arriving, Emily arriving. Whether that was coincidence or not was a question she wasn't ready to answer yet, but it sat in her mind with the particular weight of things that deserved attention. "Where is Fells now?" Veltri asked. "That's the problem," the agent said. "He was on the administrative floor 40 minutes ago in a meeting with 2 of our people. He stepped out to take a phone call and didn't come back." The room absorbed that. "Same pattern," Emily said. "Voss and Fells. Both move when pressure is applied. Someone's running a playbook." Veltri was already on her feet. "Seal the building exits. All of them. Not just the staff doors. Any vehicle that came in after 7 a.m. doesn't leave until we've run the plate." She looked at the agent. "And I want Fells's phone records. Office line, personal cell, anything he used on hospital grounds, starting from the moment we arrived in the parking lot." The agent went. Veltri looked at Emily. "You recognized his name," Veltri said, "from a briefing document. A contractor liaison list 7 years ago. Did you interact with him?" "No, he was administrative. Rear echelon. I wouldn't have had reason to." "But his name was attached to your unit's logistics network, supply chain, medical resupply, equipment, that kind of thing." Emily stopped. She thought about what that meant specifically, what a defense procurement liaison in her unit's theater would have had access to. Supply manifests, medical equipment orders, distribution channels. The compound had to come from somewhere. It had to be synthesized somewhere, stored somewhere, moved through a chain of custody from the point of origin to the forward operating base where it had first appeared, and then through whatever pathway led from that base to a hospital room in Dalton Falls, Colorado. Logistics was how it moved. "He's not a scientist," Emily said. "He didn't make it. He moved it." Veltri looked at her. "Fells managed the supply chain that the compound moved through," Emily said. "That's what his attachment to our unit's network means. He had access to the manifest, the distribution records, the paperwork that could make a chemical compound look like standard medical supply inventory." She looked at the tablet. "And he's been here 11 years. Before the deployment, before Voss. He was already in place." Veltri's expression shifted with the precision of someone updating a mental model that had just become significantly more complex. "This hospital wasn't a coincidence," she said. "It was a destination," Emily said. The next 20 minutes moved in the particular compressed way of situations where too many things were happening in parallel for any single person to have complete awareness of all of them. Veltri's team spread through the building with the systematic efficiency of people who had practiced this kind of sweep, and Emily stayed in the conference room because Veltri had asked her to, not ordered, asked, which was a different thing, and because the conference room had a glass wall that let her watch the corridor, and because sitting still was the right call when you didn't have complete information, which was something she had to remind herself of because every instinct she had was telling her to move. At 12:17, Dupree came back. "Fells is in the building," he said. "Security camera on sublevel 1 picked him up 6 minutes ago. He's heading toward the maintenance corridor." "That goes to the boiler room and the backup generator," Emily said, "and the secondary network closet for the hospital's communication system." Veltri looked at her. "If you wanted to disrupt communications, Internal phones, the intercom, the nurse call system. That's where you'd go, Emily said. Or if you wanted to make a call that didn't go through the hospital's logged network. Or both, Dupree said. Veltri made a decision with the economy of motion of someone who had been making decisions under time pressure long enough that the deliberation had become internal and invisible. Take 2 people and move on the maintenance corridor. Don't wait for him to finish whatever he's doing. She looked at Emily. Stay here. Veltri. I mean it this time, Veltri said, and there was something in her voice that was not a negotiation, the voice of someone who was responsible for the outcome of this operation and was being specific about the terms. You've given us more than we could have found in a week. Let us do the next part. Emily sat down. She lasted 4 minutes. Not because she was impatient, or not only because of that. She lasted 4 minutes, and then the intercom system in the corridor outside crackled and went silent. Mid-sentence, the voice of a nurse paging a physician cutting off abruptly in a way that was not how intercoms ended transmissions, and the ceiling-mounted monitor that showed the hospital's internal communication status flickered and went to a standby screen, and Emily understood that Fells had reached the network closet before Veltri's people had reached Fells. She was out the conference room door before she'd consciously decided to move. The administrative floor was partially cleared, 2 agents at the elevator bank, 1 at the stairwell door, the rest deployed through the building. The agent at the stairwell was a young man who looked at Emily with the expression of someone who had been told to hold a position and was now encountering a complication. The comms just went down, Emily said. Your team is in the basement corridor without internal communication. Veltri needs to know. He was reaching for his radio. I can relay. Your radio uses the hospital's internal repeater system, Emily said, which runs through the network closet that Fells just accessed. Test it. He tested it. Static. He looked at Emily. The agents in the basement have external secure comms, Emily said. But if Fells knows the building layout, and if he's been here 11 years, he does, he'll know that the maintenance corridor has a secondary access point that comes out near the physical therapy wing on sublevel 2. If he gets to that exit, he's out of the building through a door that's not on your primary seal. How do you know about the secondary access? I walk when I can't sleep, Emily said. I need to get to sublevel 2. He thought about it for 2 seconds, which was the right amount of time to think about something like this, and then he stepped aside. Emily went down. Sublevel 2 was the part of the hospital that patients never saw, and most staff only visited when they had to. Pipes and conduits, and the hum of building systems, the infrastructure that kept everything above it running, and that was maintained by a rotating crew of facilities workers who moved through it with the comfortable familiarity of people of machine oil and recycled air. The lighting was fluorescent and industrial, mounted high and casting deep shadows between the equipment banks, and Emily moved through it with the flashlight from her belt because the overhead lights in the far section had been off for months, and she knew that too. The secondary access point was a gray metal door at the far end of the physical therapy storage annex, a corridor that was technically on sublevel 2 but accessed through a stairwell that the building's signage system had stopped referencing when the PT department relocated to the main floor 3 years ago. The door opened from the inside onto a service alley on the building's north side, a narrow channel between Keller Ridge and the adjacent parking structure, rarely used and poorly lit. Emily heard the door from 30 feet away. The latch mechanism had a specific sound. She'd come through it twice in the past 14 months during late-night building walks. Knew the way the bar released with more resistance than it should have because the frame had shifted slightly and nobody had realigned it. It made a sound like a metal ruler being snapped. She ran the last 30 feet. She hit the door 8 seconds after she heard it open, shoulder first, and came through into the service alley in the gray noon light. Garrett Fells was 15 feet ahead of her. He was not what she'd expected, which was a thing she recognized as a failure of assumption. She'd seen him in passing on the administrative floor and registered him as an administrator, trim and self-contained in a gray suit, the kind of man who moved through institutional spaces with the assurance of someone who had been in the same institution long enough that the institution had shaped itself around him. Out here, in the alley, without the suit, he'd changed into street clothes at some point in the past 40 minutes, dark jacket and slacks. He looked smaller than he had indoors, and older, and he was moving with a speed that said he knew exactly how much time he had and had done the math. He heard the door. He turned. For a moment they looked at each other across 15 feet of concrete and gray light, and Emily thought, not strategically, just as an observation, that he knew who she was. Not from the hospital, not from 14 months on the med-surg floor. He knew her the way Voss had known her, with the specific recognition of someone who had encountered her name in a context she didn't have access to. "Mr. Fells," she said. "Stop." He turned and kept moving. She went after him. The service alley ran north for approximately 60 feet before it opened onto a side street, and the side street had foot traffic and vehicle traffic, and the ordinary texture of a Saturday in a small city, and if he reached it, the complexity of the situation increased significantly. Emily closed the distance in the first 20 feet because she was running and he was walking fast, and the physics were not on his side. And then he heard her gaining and broke into a run, and the distance stabilized for a moment before she started closing it again, because she was in better condition than a man who had spent 11 years behind an administrative desk. 10 feet. 8. 5. She caught him by the back of his jacket at the northern end of the alley and pulled, and he stumbled and turned and swung at her in the disorganized way of someone who had not thrown a punch in a very long time, and she let the swing go past her shoulder and stepped inside it, and put him against the alley wall, with his arm behind him in a joint lock that was designed to be uncomfortable enough to stop movement without causing structural damage, which was the appropriate level of force for a middle-aged administrator who was running, not fighting. He made a sound of pain. "Stop moving," Emily said. "The more you move, the more that hurts." He stopped moving. She could hear footsteps in the building behind her. The door had been propped by her exit, and someone had come through it. She didn't look. She kept her attention on Fells and on the joint lock and on the wall in front of her. "Hands," said a voice behind her. "Dupree." Emily stepped back and Dupree moved in with cuffs, and 2 more agents came through the door behind him and spread to either side, and Fells was secured against the wall with the resigned compliance of a man who had run the remaining options and found them all closed. He looked at Emily over his shoulder with the joint lock released and the cuffs on, and his expression was not what she'd expected either. Not anger. Not calculation. Something closer to the expression of a person who had been carrying a weight for long enough that being stopped was, in some register she couldn't fully interpret, almost a relief. "The briefing document," he said. "You remembered my name from the briefing document." Emily didn't answer. "How many people read those all the way through?" he said. It wasn't quite rhetorical. "1, apparently," Dupree said. "Move." They brought him back through the door and up through the building, and Emily followed because nobody told her not to. And the situation had developed a momentum that seemed to be carrying her along with it, whether she was officially sanctioned to be there or not. Veltri met them in the sub-level 1 corridor outside the maintenance room. Behind her, through the open door, Emily could see the network closet, a wall of server racks and patch panels, a floor cabinet that had been opened and partially cleared, and one of Veltri's agents crouched over a piece of equipment that he was photographing with a methodical thoroughness that suggested it was either important or damaged, or both. "The system can be restored," the agent said without looking up. He disconnected the internal repeater relay but didn't damage the hardware. "We're looking at 20 minutes to restore full comms." "What did he use the time for?" Veltri asked. "Made 2 calls," the agent said. "External line, bypassed the logged network. We'll need a warrant for the carrier records, but the calls went out during the window and we have the timestamp." Veltri looked at Fells. Fells looked at the corridor wall. 2 calls in 6 minutes, Veltri said. "Who did you call?" Fells said nothing. "His attorney is going to tell him not to say anything," Dupree said, "so we might as well move to processing and let the phone records do the work." "The calls went somewhere," Emily said. "They went to someone who's now been told that Foss is in custody, that the network closet was accessed, and whatever else Fells could transmit in 6 minutes, which means whoever is at the end of those calls is making decisions right now about what to do with that information." Veltri looked at her. "And the Admiral is still in this building," Emily said. Veltri was already on her external comm unit. "Room 7. Confirm status. Confirm visual on the patient." A pause. 3 seconds. 5. 10. "Room 7. Veltri repeated. "Confirm status." The reply came back with the particular quality of a voice that was working to sound measured and not entirely succeeding. "Agent Morrison, there's a situation up here. We need medical. Now." Emily was already moving toward the stairs. She took them 3 at a time, which she could do going up if she used the railing and didn't think about it. And she was through the stairwell door on the 3rd floor and running the corridor before Veltri's voice on the radio behind her had finished relaying the medical request. She knew this corridor, knew it in the daytime, and knew it at 3 a.m., and knew which rooms were on which side and where the crash cart was staged, and where the nursing station had sight lines and where it didn't, and she used all of that without consciously accessing it, the knowledge expressing itself as movement. Room 7's door was open. The agent inside, Morrison, she assumed, was standing at the side of the bed with his radio in one hand and the other hand pressed to the call button panel, which was non-functional because the intercom was down. And the Admiral was on the bed with his eyes closed and the oxygen mask on the floor beside the bed, and his color wrong in a way that Emily recognized from a different context as venous pooling, the particular gray-blue of a circulatory system that had been disrupted. The monitor showed a rhythm, irregular, bradycardic, heart rate in the low 40s, dropping. "What happened?" Emily said, moving to the bed. "I don't know," Morrison said. "He was talking. He said he felt cold, and then..." "When?" 3 minutes ago, maybe 4. Emily looked at the IV stand. The line had been capped. They'd removed the original bag after the lab and hadn't replaced it, which was the right call. There was nothing infusing. She looked at the monitor. 41 beats per minute, and the rhythm was irregular in a pattern she'd seen before, not a standard bradycardia, something with a specific morphology. She looked at the room. She looked at the walls, the ceiling, the floor, the oxygen outlet. The oxygen outlet. The secondary tube from the call button panel had been incomplete. Voss had said so himself. But there was a second outlet in the room, the one above the head of the bed, the standard wall-mounted port with the flow meter attached. She looked at the flow meter. The dial was set to 6 liters per minute, which was where it had been when she'd left. She looked at the connector between the outlet and the mask tubing on the floor. The mask was on the floor, but the outlet was still open. She crossed to the wall outlet and looked at it closely. The connector port had a secondary fitting that hadn't been there yesterday. She was certain of it, certain in the way of someone who had looked at this room more than once and whose memory for physical details was not decorative. A small adapter, gray plastic, barely visible against the white wall fitting. She pulled it. It came out with slight resistance, and when it came free, she looked at it and understood immediately what it was. A passive diffusion adapter, the kind of device that allowed a secondary substance to be introduced into a gas line through osmotic pressure without an active pump, without electronics, without anything that would appear on a power consumption log or trigger a mechanical alarm. It was the kind of device that required someone to install it physically, directly, with hands in the room. Someone had been in this room. Not during her watch, not during Morrison's watch. Before. While the room was being set up for the Admiral in the hours before his arrival, when the facilities team came through to check the equipment and the nursing staff came through to stock the supply cart, and there were enough people moving in and out that one additional person could move with the current without standing out. "I need atropine, Mum," Emily said. "The crash cart, is it in the corridor?" "Yes." "Get it in here, now." She was already at the head of the bed. "And I need you to call down to the pharmacy for a specific push. Write this down. Atropine sulfate, 0.5 milligrams IV, and I need it in this room in the next 8 minutes. I'm not authorized to order. Then find someone who is and tell them what I just told you. The rhythm on that monitor is not a standard bradycardia. It's a chemically induced nodal suppression, and the treatment window is closing." She looked at him directly. "Go." He went. Emily turned back to the Admiral. She pulled on gloves from the box on the supply cart. They were there, standard placement. She knew where they were. And she checked his pupils. Sluggish but reactive. Responsive to stimulus. She pressed 2 fingers to his radial pulse and counted, and the count was not good, but it was not flatline, which was the margin she was working with. "Admiral," she said. His eyes opened. Slowly, the way of someone fighting sedation they hadn't consented to. "Hey," she said, which was not medical terminology, but it was direct and it was human, and sometimes that mattered. He focused on her. "Harlan," he said. His voice was thicker than it had been 4 hours ago. "You're bradycardic. Something was introduced into your oxygen supply. I need you to breathe shallowly. Don't deep breathe. Don't compensate. Let your body do what it's doing." That sounds bad, he said. It sounds bad, she confirmed. But you're talking, which is what I need you to keep doing. The crash cart came through the door, pushed by Morrison with a second agent behind him and one of the day shift nurses, a woman named Petra, who Emily had worked alongside for 6 months, and who took in the scene with the professional assessment of someone shifting into emergency mode, her eyes going to the monitor, to the Admiral, to Emily. What do you need? Petra said. Atropine from the cart, 0.5 IV push, and we need to get a physician in here who can authorize a cardiac consult and document the intervention. She looked at Petra. I know I'm not on the floor anymore. I'm asking anyway. Petra looked at her for 1 second. I know what you did last night, she said. Tell me what you need. What Emily needed, she got. Not perfectly. The atropine push was delayed by 90 seconds while the on-call attending was reached by cell phone since the internal system was down, and the attending arrived in the room still pulling on his coat. And there was a moment when the monitor dropped to 38 beats per minute that was genuinely bad, the kind of moment that lived in memory afterward with a specific texture. But the atropine went in and the rhythm responded. Not immediately, not cleanly, in the stuttering incremental way of a system under chemical load that was fighting to restabilize. And 4 minutes after the push, the monitor was reading 52, and the color in the Admiral's face had moved away from gray. Emily stepped back from the bed and let the attending take over. She stripped the gloves and stood against the wall and watched. Veltri arrived 3 minutes later with Dupree and 2 additional agents, and she came through the door and looked at the monitor and looked at the Admiral and looked at Emily. Again, Veltri said. It wasn't a question. The oxygen outlet, Emily said. Passive diffusion adapter. Pre-installed, probably before he arrived. Someone with facilities access who knew the room assignment in advance. We had agents on the door. You had agents on the door after last night. This was installed before last night. Emily looked at the adapter, which was sitting on the supply cart where she'd placed it. He's been here 48 hours. The room was prepared 48 hours ago. Whoever gave the room assignment gave the installation window. Veltri turned. Who assigned the room? She said to Morrison. Morrison looked at his notes. Deputy COO's office, he said. Standard VIP protocol. Room assignment goes through administration. Veltri said nothing. Her jaw was doing the thing Emily had noticed earlier, the small tension that happened when Veltri was adding something to an internal accounting that was getting long. Fells assigned the room, Emily said. Voss was supposed to finish him last night, and the backup was in the oxygen line. When Voss failed, the backup activated. Except it activated slowly because the diffusion adapter works on osmotic pressure over time, not immediately, which is why it took hours. Redundancy, Dupree said. They built in redundancy, Emily said. This wasn't improvised. Every piece of this was planned before the Admiral arrived at this hospital. The only thing that wasn't planned was me. The room was quiet except for the monitor, which had moved to 57 and was climbing. The Admiral was watching Emily from the bed with the clear evaluating attention of someone who had been a target twice in 12 hours and was doing his own accounting. Harlan, he said. She looked at him. I need to make a call, he said. A specific call, to specific people, and I need to make it now, not through the hospital system, not through their radios. He looked at Veltri. I need a secure external line, and I need the agent you trust most in this room to be the only other person present. Veltri didn't hesitate. Dupree, she said. Clear the room except for medical. People moved. Emily didn't move. Veltri looked at her. She stays, the Admiral said. Veltri's expression said several things simultaneously. She said none of them out loud. She looked at Dupree, who looked at the ceiling briefly, and then the room cleared except for Petra monitoring the equipment, Dupree at the door, and Emily at the wall. The Admiral held out his hand. Dupree produced a secure satellite handset and placed it in the Admiral's palm, and the Admiral dialed from memory, 7 digits, and waited. 2 rings. A voice answered. The Admiral said 4 words that Emily heard clearly. And the world Emily had been carefully building in Dalton Falls for 14 months, the quiet apartment, the gray sedan, the floor shifts and the second-hand couch, and the coffee maker and the locked cabinet she never opened at work, became, in that moment, entirely and irrevocably the past. Because the voice on the other end of that call said something back to the Admiral, and the Admiral looked at Emily when he heard it, and what he said next was not something she had been prepared for. They pulled this classified file, he said. Your classified file. The full version, not the redacted one that went to the hospital. He paused. There are pages in that file that you've never seen. Emily went very still. Pages that were sealed above your clearance level, the Admiral said. Added after your separation. His voice was steady and measured, the voice of a man who had delivered difficult information before and knew that the delivery mattered. Emily, the deaths in your unit. The 4 that we told you about. Yes, she said. There were more, he said. And there are names in that file. Names of people who authorized what happened to your unit, who signed off on the compound's deployment, who approved the cover-up afterward. He held the phone slightly away from his ear. One of those names is someone you know. Emily looked at the monitor, 61 beats per minute. Not Voss, the Admiral said. Not Fells. He met her eyes. Someone you trusted. The door to room 7 opened. Not Dupree. Not an agent. A woman in a hospital administrator's badge, moving with the confidence of someone who belonged in the building, and Emily recognized her in the half-second before everything changed. Recognized the gray suit, the close-cropped hair, the evaluating expression that she had sat across from for 4 hours in a conference room on the administrative floor. Special Agent Nora Veltri was not standing in the doorway. The woman standing in the doorway was wearing Veltri's badge. The woman in the doorway held the position for exactly 2 seconds, long enough for Emily to complete the recognition, short enough that it read as a natural pause rather than a hesitation, and then she stepped fully into the room and closed the door behind her with the precise, unhurried motion of someone who had thought through this entrance. She was wearing Veltri's badge on a lanyard. Veltri's coat. The close-cropped hair was the same. The build was close enough that in a corridor, in passing, with the badge visible, nobody would have stopped her. Emily's first thought was not fear. It was a specific, cold calculation. Veltri is somewhere in this building, and she is not wearing her coat. Her second thought was the distance between herself and the door, which was 12 feet with the woman blocking it, and the distance between herself and the crash cart, which was 4 feet, and what was on the crash cart that was useful. Dupree was outside the door. He hadn't come in with the woman, which meant he either hadn't been paying attention, unlikely, he was good, or the woman had come from a direction that didn't require passing him, which meant she'd used the room's secondary access through the bathroom connecting to the adjacent suite, which was a detail about room 7 that Emily had not known until this moment. Close the saturation monitor, the woman said to Petra. Her voice was even, instructive, the voice of someone giving a reasonable clinical direction. Petra looked at Emily. Don't, Emily said. The woman's hand came out of her coat pocket. Not a firearm. Something smaller, which in its own way was worse, because small meant precise and precise meant specific intent. A pre-filled syringe, the cap already removed, held with the practiced grip of someone who had administered injections before, the barrel visible and the plunger depressed fractionally to clear the air. Emily looked at the syringe, then at the woman, then at the Admiral, who was tracking everything from the bed with the focused attention of someone conserving energy for the right moment. What's in it? Emily said. A correction, the woman said. The original plan was cleaner. You made it complicated. I do that, Emily said. Step away from the bed. Emily did not step away from the bed. The woman moved to the left, toward the monitoring equipment, keeping her back to the wall and the syringe visible, and her distance from both Emily and the Admiral approximately equal. She knew what she was doing. She was creating angles, putting herself in a position where any movement Emily made toward her also increased Emily's distance from the Admiral. Who are you? Emily said. She was asking partly because she wanted to know, and partly because talking kept the syringe stationary. Someone who's been managing this operation longer than you've been aware it exists, the woman said. Voss and Fells were logistics. I'm not logistics. You're the principal, Emily said. It landed as a statement rather than a question, and she watched the woman's expression confirm it. Not by changing, but by not changing, the particular stillness of someone who didn't bother with denial. Where's Veltri? Emily said. Stairwell B. She's fine, zip-tied to a pipe, which is not how I wanted this to go, but she walked into the basement at the wrong moment. The woman glanced at the monitor. The saturation is dropping again. It was. 68%. 66. The diffusion adapter is out, Emily said. I removed it. You removed one of them, the woman said. Emily's eyes went to the oxygen outlet above the bed. then to the secondary wall outlet near the bathroom door, which she had not checked, which she had not thought to check because she had found the adapter and stopped looking, and that was a mistake. A genuine and consequential mistake that she was now holding. She crossed to the secondary outlet. "Don't," the woman said, and there was movement in her peripheral vision, the woman moving, closing distance. And Emily reached the outlet and found it, a second adapter, identical to the first, gray plastic, almost flush with the wall fitting. She pulled it. The woman was 4 feet away when Emily turned around, and the syringe was level and aimed, and there was no longer distance between them that the situation could absorb. Emily threw the adapter, not at the woman's face, at the monitor display to the woman's left, where it hit the screen and clattered off the equipment cart, and the sudden movement and sound pulled the woman's eyes for the fraction of a second that it was designed to, and in that fraction Emily stepped inside the syringe's reach and got both hands on the woman's wrist. What followed was not clean. It was not the functional, efficient physical exchange that it looked like in controlled training environments. The woman was trained, not in the way of an administrator who had taken a self-defense course, but actually trained, the kind of economical resistance that expressed itself in the use of body weight rather than strength. And Emily was running on 3 hours of broken sleep from the night before, and the cumulative drain of a 15-hour shift that had ended with her being fired. And her right knee hit the corner of the crash cart during the second rotation, and she registered the pain as information rather than sensation and kept her grip on the wrist. Petra was against the far wall, which was where Emily needed her to be. The Admiral was not against the far wall. He was upright in the bed, both hands gripping the bed rail, watching the fight with the expression of a man who was calculating whether he could stand up and what he would do if he could. And Emily said, "Stay down," without looking at him because she needed him stationary and she needed the bed to stay where it was because she was using it as a positioning anchor. The syringe hit the floor when she bent the wrist past the angle that the grip could sustain. The woman went for it. Emily put her knee on the woman's back and her forearm across the back of her shoulders and held her down on the linoleum with the weight distribution she'd been taught by a staff sergeant who had told her once that the point of a hold was not to be stronger than the person underneath you. It was to make their leverage worse than yours, and she focused on that principle with everything she had. The door opened. Dupree. He took in the room in approximately 1 second. Emily on the floor pinning a woman in Veltri's coat. The syringe 3 feet away. The Admiral gripping the bed rail. Petra against the wall. And he was across the room and had the woman's wrist secured before Emily had fully processed that he was there. She stood up. Her knee was telling her something she'd address later. "Veltri," Emily said. "Stairwell B." She said Veltri is in Stairwell B. Dupree was already on his external comm. He relayed the location and looked at the woman on the floor, who was face down and breathing, and had gone to the particular stillness of someone who had reached the end of their options. "The second adapter," Emily said to Dupree. "There were 2. I have both of them." She held them out, and he took them in his gloved hand and bagged them without being asked. Then Emily sat on the floor because her knee was telling her something that was no longer optional to ignore, and she put her back against the bed frame and breathed. The Admiral looked down at her. "You're on the floor," he said. "I know," Emily said. "Is that a strategic position?" "Not anymore," she said. Something in his face moved. Not quite a smile, something quieter and more considered than a smile. The expression of a man who had watched someone operate under pressure and was revising a number of assessments in real time. "The file," Emily said. "You said there were names. You said someone I trusted." He was quiet for a moment. "Do you want that conversation now?" "I want it before someone else comes through the connecting bathroom," Emily said. He accepted that. "The name in the sealed section," he said, "is a Colonel Raymond Tusk. He was your unit's oversight officer during the deployment." Emily looked at the wall. Tusk had been, for 9 months, the voice that came through the encrypted line every 72 hours with mission updates and supply confirmations, and the particular institutional reassurance of a commanding officer who seemed to know where everything was and what everything meant. She had trusted him in the specific functional way that you trusted the structural integrity of the building you were working inside. Not emotionally, not personally, but with the operational certainty that without that trust, the whole structure failed. "He authorized the compound's deployment," the Admiral said. "He approved the cover-up of the first 2 deaths. When Daniel Fry began asking questions, Tusk authorized the measures that resulted in Fry's accident. He paused. He's been protected by people above him who needed the operation to remain classified, and those people have been protected by the contracts those operations generated, and it has been a very long chain with a lot of institutional weight keeping it from being examined. "Where is he now?" Emily said. "Pentagon," the Admiral said. "Still active, still decorated. I was promoted 8 months ago." Emily sat with that. "He's the one who sealed the pages," the Admiral said. "Above your clearance level. He decided what you were and weren't allowed to know about your own service." The room was very quiet. "Can you get him?" Emily said. "I've been trying to for 2 years," the Admiral said. "Which is why someone put me in this hospital." He held up the satellite phone, which was still active, the line still open. "The person on the other end of this call," he said, "is the Inspector General of the United States Army. She has been on this line for the past 11 minutes. Emily stared at the phone. "She heard everything that happened in this room," the Admiral said, "including the identity of the woman on the floor, who is a senior defense intelligence contractor named Sylvia Brandt, and whose name has appeared in 3 separate IG complaint files in the past 6 years and been removed from 2 of them by persons whose authority to remove it is now going to be examined very carefully." He extended the phone toward Emily. She took it. The voice on the other end was a woman's voice, measured and precise, with the quality of someone who was used to hearing difficult information and responding to it without the response becoming the event. "Staff Sergeant Harlan," the voice said. "I'm not a staff sergeant anymore," Emily said. "No," the voice said. "You're not." A pause. "I want to be direct with you about the next several hours. What happened in that room is going to require your full cooperation with our office, including a formal deposition that will cover your deployment, your knowledge of the compound, and everything that has happened in Dalton Falls in the past 24 hours. That process will not be brief and it will not be comfortable." "Okay," Emily said. "I also want to be direct about something else," the IG said. "The sealed pages of your file, the ones added after your separation, above your clearance level, are being unsealed as of this conversation. You'll have full access within the hour. And what's in them is going to be difficult to read." Emily looked at the 2 adapters in Dupree's evidence bag. She looked at the woman on the floor. She looked at the Admiral, who was watching her with the steady attention of someone bearing witness to a thing that mattered. "I've been waiting 3 years," Emily said. "I can read it." The next 4 hours moved with the particular organized intensity of a situation that had accumulated enough mass to pull multiple agencies into the same space. By 2 p.m., Keller Ridge Medical Center's administrative floor had been effectively converted into a field command post, with personnel from the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, the Army Inspector General's office, the FBI's Denver field office, and the County Sheriff's Department occupying different corners of the floor, with the productive friction of organizations that needed each other but had not practiced working together recently. Veltri was found in stairwell B with a contusion on her left temple and a level of composure that Emily found both admirable and slightly alarming. She refused medical evaluation twice before accepting it on the 3rd offer, which suggested she was operating on the principle that admitting injury was a professional concession she wasn't willing to make until the situation was stable, and Emily recognized that principle from the inside. Sylvia Brandt was processed at the county facility because the federal holding in Denver was a 2-hour drive and nobody wanted to move her while the building was still being fully secured. She said nothing from the moment Dupree cuffed her to the moment she was placed in a sheriff's vehicle. Nothing. Even when the sheriff's deputy told her she was being charged with attempted murder of a federal official, conspiracy, and impersonating a federal agent, and the nothing was not the nothing of someone who was scared or overwhelmed, but the nothing of someone who had made a strategic decision about silence and was executing it with discipline. Garrett Fells, in contrast, started talking before he'd been formally processed, which Dupree said was either a good sign or a trap, and he was treating it as both. Fells talked about Voss. He talked about the room assignment protocol and how the compound had come into the hospital's supply chain through a medical equipment resupply order that had been coded to mask its origin. He talked about Sylvia Brandt, whom he had met twice in person and communicated with through an encrypted channel that he described as having been established by people above him. People he named with the detailed specificity of someone who had been holding those names for a long time and was experiencing the relief of setting them down. Some of the names were familiar to the investigators. Some of them produced expressions in the room that Emily read as the expressions of people encountering confirmation of things they had suspected and had not been able to reach. One of the names was Colonel Raymond Tusk. Emily was present when Fells said it. Not in the room. Through the glass wall of the conference room where she'd been for the past hour, completing her formal statement, she watched Fells's face when he gave the name and watched the investigators' faces when they received it. And she thought about a voice coming through an encrypted line every 72 hours, steady and authoritative, and about 9 months of trusting the structure. Her unsealed file arrived at 3:47 p.m. on a secure tablet that Dupree placed in front of her without comment. He left the room and closed the door. She sat alone with it. The sealed section was 31 pages. It had been compiled over 14 months following her separation. Interviews with people she hadn't known were being interviewed. Analysis of communications she hadn't known were being analyzed. Assessments of her knowledge and her potential testimony, and whether she was, in the language of the document, a risk to operational security. It was the paperwork of a system deciding whether she was a liability. It used her name throughout, assessed her psychological state, her habits, her location, and it had been filed and sealed by a colonel who had spoken to her from thousands of miles away through an encrypted line and said things like, "Good work. Harlan and your unit is the best I've deployed, and we're going to bring all of you home." She read all 31 pages. She read the section on Daniel Fry last. It was 4 pages long, and it was specific, and it was written in the bloodless institutional prose of someone documenting a decision, not confessing to one. And it told her clearly and completely what had been done and why, and who had authorized it. She sat with it for a while. Then she set the tablet on the table and stood up and looked out the glass wall at the floor where the investigation was continuing. And the people in it were moving with the purposeful energy of a process that was now large enough to be self-sustaining, larger than any single person's ability to contain or divert. And she felt something that she was not immediately able to name. Not relief, not vindication, not the satisfaction she'd imagined in the 3 years she'd carried this, when she had allowed herself to imagine what it would feel like if the weight were ever acknowledged as real. Something simpler and more fundamental than any of those. The feeling of a thing being true in the world in a way that could be seen by other people. Of evidence existing where before there had only been her knowledge and her grief and nowhere for either to go. Dupree knocked on the glass. She opened the door. "The U.S. Attorney's Office is filing," he said, "based on Fells's statement, the IG deposition, the physical evidence from the room, and the communication records from this morning. They're moving fast." "How fast?" Emily said. "Indictments by end of week, they think. Maybe sooner." He paused. "Tusk is going to be informed of the investigation this evening. Military protocol requires notification before he can be confined to base, which means there's a window." "Will he run?" "We don't think so," Dupree said. "He's been protected for too long. He thinks the protection holds." He said it without judgment, which was the professional version of contempt. "He's going to find out it doesn't." Emily looked at the floor through the glass. She looked at the hallway beyond, where 2 agents were walking with Fells toward the elevator bank. Fells moving with the specific posture of someone who had made a decision and was following it through. "The hospital," she said. "My termination this morning." "That's going to look very different in about 48 hours, Dupree said. "When the administrative chain is fully examined and the credentialing bypass is part of a federal record, the circumstances of your termination become part of that record." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not a lawyer, but I've worked enough of these cases to tell you that the hospital's legal department is going to have a difficult conversation about what happened this morning." Emily thought about Deborah Weil and the 12-minute meeting and the piece of paper she'd signed without reading the bottom section because she'd been thinking about the color of that IV fluid. She thought about the HR office and the 4-minute conversation and her badge and her access card and her parking permit. She thought about the coffee maker in her apartment and the locked cabinet in her closet that she'd never opened at work. "What happens now?" she said. "Today. This evening." "We need you available," Dupree said, "because the IG office is going to want you reachable for the formal deposition, which is being scheduled for Monday. Between now and then—" He stopped. He seemed to be thinking about how to phrase something. "You should get some sleep," he said, which was not what he'd been about to say, but which was also true. Emily went to find Veltri. She was on the administrative floor's far end, near a window that looked out over the parking lot and the service road and the mountain in the middle distance that sat above Dalton Falls. like a permanent reminder that the town was small relative to the landscape around it. She had a bandage on her left temple and a cup of coffee in her right hand, and she was looking at her phone with the expression of someone who had 17 unread messages and was deciding which ones mattered. She looked up when Emily came over. "You should have stayed in the conference room," she said. "I know," Emily said. "Brant came through the connecting bathroom." "I know that now," Veltri said. "We cleared the adjacent suite when she arrived. We didn't think about the connection." She said it without excess, not beating herself up, not moving past it too fast, just stating a failure precisely. "That's on me." "We both made assumptions," Emily said. Veltri looked at her. "How's the knee?" "I'll know more tomorrow." "There's a clinic 2 blocks from the hospital that's open Saturdays until 6, Veltri said. "I already looked it up." She paused. "I want you to know something. The way you operated today, not just last night, today, the entire sequence. I've worked with trained agents who would not have done what you did in that room." Emily said nothing. "I'm saying that as a statement of fact, not a compliment," Veltri said. "The IG's office is going to want your full file, the unsealed version, and the testimony you give on Monday is going to be the foundation of a federal case that has been trying to stand up for 2 years. She looked at Emily directly. "You understand what I'm saying?" "You're saying I'm the thing the case has been missing," Emily said. "I'm saying you were always the thing the case was missing," Veltri said. "They just couldn't reach you because you were in Dalton Falls being quiet." Emily looked out the window. The parking lot was still full of federal vehicles, their presence now explanatory to the town in a way it hadn't been this morning. She could see 2 news vans parked on the service road beyond the lot perimeter. Local affiliates, from the look of the equipment, arrived in the past hour. "The news," Emily said. "We're managing the release," Veltri said. "No names until the indictments are filed. But the general outline is going to be out by tomorrow morning. Federal operation at a Dalton Falls hospital. Arrests made. Ongoing investigation." Emily thought about the town of 50,000 and the twice-weekly newspaper and Paula Irk, the sheriff, who showed up to federal events because it was better to be present than to hear about it later. She thought about the med-surg floor and the patients in beds 12 through 19 who had needed their vitals checked and their IV bags changed and their call lights answered, and who were presumably being cared for right now by someone else. She thought about 14 months of being treated like a coat hook. "There's going to be a question," she said, "about the nurse who pulled the IV. It's going to come out." "It already has," Veltri said. 2 of the day shift nurses talked to the sheriff's deputies this morning. The version of events they gave is accurate, and it names you. Emily absorbed that. "How do you feel about that?" Veltri said. It was the first personal question Veltri had asked her all day, and Emily looked at her for a moment before answering. "I don't know yet," Emily said. And that was the truth. Not the truth she'd expected, not the resolution she'd spent 3 years constructing in her imagination, but the actual truth, which was that she was standing in a hospital that had fired her 8 hours ago, with a knee she'd damaged doing something she hadn't been authorized to do, on the edge of a visibility she had specifically built her life in Dalton Falls to avoid, and she didn't know how she felt about it yet because she hadn't had time to find out. "That's a reasonable answer," Veltri said. Emily's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. An email notification from Keller Ridge Medical Center's HR department with the subject line, "Re-employment status, Harlan E. Urgent review requested." She looked at it for a moment. Then she put the phone in her pocket. "I need to get to that clinic before 6, she said. Veltri almost smiled. "Dupree can drive you." "I know where it is," Emily said. "I'll walk." She took the stairs down and went through the lobby, which was quieter than it had been this morning. The information desk woman no longer on the phone, but simply watching the door with the absorbed attention of someone whose ordinary day had become something else entirely, and who was still processing the transition. Emily walked past her and through the automatic doors and out into the afternoon, which was cold and bright, and the particular blue sky clarity of a mountain November that looked like a lie about how cold it was. She walked the 2 blocks to the clinic. She sat in the waiting room for 23 minutes with 3 other people. A teenager with a wrist wrapped in a bandage, an older man reading a magazine from 3 months ago, a woman with a toddler on her lap who was conducting a quiet but passionate negotiation with the child about a toy the child was attempting to eat. She looked at her phone. The sealed file was still open on the secure tablet back at the hospital, but she had read it, all 31 pages, and the names were in her head now in the permanent way of things that had been confirmed rather than suspected. And she ran through them methodically in the waiting room while the toddler won the negotiation and ate the corner of the toy, and the woman sighed with the exhaustion of someone who had given up a battle to preserve energy for the war. Tusk. Brandt, Fells, Voss. The names above Tusk in the authorization chain, which were names she hadn't known before today and which were now part of a federal record. Daniel Fry's name was also in the file, not as an actor, as a victim, documented with the precision of a system that had made a decision about him and was recording its own justification. Emily sat with his name. She had not been able to grieve him properly in 3 years because grieving him properly required confirming what had happened to him, and confirming what happened to him required access to a truth that had been sealed above her clearance level by the man who had authorized it. She could grieve him now. She didn't, not in the waiting room with the toddler and the old man and the wrist bandage. But she registered that she could, and that it was waiting for her, and that was itself something. The nurse called her name. She stood up, and her knee registered its objection, and she walked into the examination room and sat on the paper-covered table and answered the intake questions. How did the injury occur? Was there a fall? How would she rate the pain? And she gave answers that were technically accurate and entirely insufficient as a description of the day. The physician, a young man who looked like he'd been awake for slightly too long, examined the knee, ordered an X-ray, reviewed the X-ray, and told her it was a significant contusion with possible minor ligament involvement and that she needed to keep off it for 48 hours and return if the swelling increased. She said she would. She took the prescription for the anti-inflammatory and the printout with the care instructions, and she walked, limped, marginally, back toward Keller Ridge as the afternoon light shifted toward the particular amber of early mountain evening. Her phone rang as she turned onto the hospital access road. Unknown number, different from this morning's. She answered. Emily Harlan. A man's voice, formal, measured, with the particular cadence of someone reading from a script they've rehearsed. Yes, she said. This is the office of the Army Inspector General. I'm calling to inform you that based on events today and the testimonial record established this afternoon, a formal review of your military service record has been initiated. This review includes, but is not limited to, the circumstances of your separation, the accuracy of the official record as it pertains to your unit's deployment, and the appropriateness of certain administrative actions taken during and after your service. Emily stopped walking. Additionally, the voice continued, I'm authorized to inform you that a preliminary commendation has been recommended by the reviewing officer, Admiral Thomas Wakefield, pending formal review board approval. The commendation covers actions taken in the performance of duty on the dates of this calendar month at Keller Ridge Medical Center, Dalton Falls, Colorado. She stood on the hospital access road with the amber light coming across the mountain and a cold wind moving from the north, and she listened to the rest of the statement, which was detailed and formal and covered things she would need to respond to in writing within 10 business days. She said she understood. She ended the call. She stood there for a moment longer than she needed to, not because she was collecting herself, but because the particular quality of the afternoon light was doing something to the mountain that deserved to be looked at for a moment. The light finding the edges of the rock and the tree line with the specific clarity that came right before the color drained out of the sky. Her phone buzzed again. A text. From the number she recognized as the hospital's HR extension. Ms. Harlan, please be aware that your termination this morning has been flagged for urgent review by hospital legal counsel. We request that you do not take any external action regarding your employment status until you have spoken with... She put the phone in her pocket. She went back into the hospital. Dupree was in the lobby, and he looked at her knee and at the clinic bag in her hand and said nothing about either, which was one of the things she had come to appreciate about him over the course of a very long day. Hey, Tusk, she said. Being notified as we speak, Dupree said. Military protocol, as I said. And after the notification? Watch begins immediately. He won't move without us knowing. He paused. There's something else. The phone carrier records from Fells's calls this morning. They came back faster than expected. The 2 calls he made from the network closet. Who did he call? Emily said. The first call went to Brandt's burner. That's expected. He looked at her with the specific expression of someone who is about to say something that is going to change the weight distribution of the conversation. The second call went to a number registered to an office in the Pentagon. Emily waited. "Colonel Raymond Tusk's direct line," Dupree said. "Tusk knew," Emily said. "Within minutes of our arrival this morning. He's known all day." "Which means every decision he's made today has been made with that knowledge," Dupree said. "Every call he took, every meeting he attended, every piece of paper he signed or didn't sign." He held her gaze. "We've been monitoring his communications since the carrier records came back, which was about 45 minutes ago." "And?" Emily said. Dupree's expression shifted in a way that told her the answer before he said it. "He made 11 calls in the past 40 minutes, Dupree said. 7 to numbers we've now identified as connected to the defense contractor network that procured and moved the compound. 2 to his personal attorney, 1 to a commercial airline, which was a reservation inquiry." He paused one final time, and what he said next was the thing that had been building all day. The thing that the entire weight of the investigation had been leaning toward without anyone being certain what shape it would take when it arrived. "And 1 call 4 minutes ago to a number we are still tracing, but whose first 6 digits match the routing code for a foreign diplomatic communication channel." Emily looked at him. "He's not just running," Dupree said. "He's been running this whole time, and we just found out where he was planning to run to." The foreign diplomatic routing code changed everything about the timeline. Dupree was on his external comm before Emily had finished processing what he'd said, and the lobby of Keller Ridge Medical Center became, in the space of about 90 seconds, a place where the air pressure seemed to change. The particular atmospheric shift of a situation that had been moving at investigative speed suddenly moving at operational speed, which were 2 different speeds with different tolerances for incomplete information. You waited for complete information in an investigation. You moved on what you had in an operation. "What channel?" Emily said. "Still tracing," Dupree said, the comm still at his ear. "But the routing pattern suggests an intermediary relay, not a direct call to a foreign entity, a layered call that goes through a domestic number first and then routes out. Standard obfuscation for someone who knows communication monitoring well enough to be careful about it." "He's been doing this for years," Emily said. "The communication infrastructure isn't improvised." "No," Dupree agreed. "Which means there's a destination," Emily said. "Not just a direction. He has a specific place he's going, a specific channel he's activated, and it was ready before today. He just didn't expect to need it this soon." Dupree relayed that to whoever was on the comm, and the response came back in the clipped shorthand of federal interdepartmental communication that Emily had enough experience with to parse without the full transcript. Pentagon security had been notified, Tusk's movements were under surveillance, travel flags had been placed on his passport and military identification, and 2 vehicles with counterintelligence personnel were already moving toward his location at Fort Meade. "He's still at the Pentagon?" Emily said. "As of 14 minutes ago," Dupree said. "Building security confirmed his badge was used to enter the East Wing at 1640. He looked at his watch. "That was 20 minutes ago." "He's not leaving through the front," Emily said. "Not with a travel flag on his ID. If he knows we have his communication records, and he doesn't know when we pulled them, so he has to assume we've had them long enough to act on them, he'll assume the standard exits are compromised." "You're thinking he has an alternate exit?" "He planned for this," Emily said. "Not this specifically, not today, but a contingency. Someone at his level who has been running a network this sophisticated for this long has a contingency." Dupree was quiet for a moment, listening to the comm. Then something in his face shifted. "They lost him," he said. Emily had expected this, and had not expected how it would feel to hear it. A cold, specific drop in the stomach, not panic, not despair, the particular feeling of a variable you'd been holding as controlled suddenly becoming uncontrolled. "How long?" she said. "Badge last scanned 7 minutes ago. Camera coverage in the East Wing has a gap in sub-level parking. Maintenance work on the security system started Monday, wasn't finished. They're treating it as a possible exit point." "Sub-level parking of the Pentagon connects to what?" Emily said. "We're defense contractors have access," she said. "His contractor network. Someone with a vehicle and a cleared parking pass and no reason to be flagged." Dupree was already relaying it. Emily stood in the lobby of Keller Ridge and looked at the automatic doors and the parking lot beyond them, where the federal vehicles were still staged, and the news vans were still on the service road, and the mountain was losing its color in the early evening, the amber draining out of the rock face as the sun moved below the ridgeline. She thought about Tusk's voice on the encrypted line. Every 72 hours. Good work, Harlan. The voice of a structure she had trusted because the structure was what kept the work possible, the thing you stood on when everything else was moving. He had built a meticulous, patient architecture of harm and had maintained it for years by staying inside systems, military hierarchy, contractor relationships, administrative protocols that were designed to move slowly and defer to authority, and he had used that deference as insulation. Nobody had investigated him because nobody with the standing to investigate him had believed the investigation was necessary. The protection wasn't just the people above him. It was the institutional inertia of a system that preferred to trust its own structures over the accounts of people who said those structures had been corrupted. The people who had said so were dead or separated or living in small cities being quiet. Her phone buzzed. Not a call. A notification from the secure tablet application that Dupree had given her access to during the afternoon's deposition preparation. A document update. She pulled it up. The foreign number Tusk had called had been traced. It was a commercial real estate holding company registered in a jurisdiction with favorable opacity laws, and the company's listed contact was a person whose name appeared in two other places in the investigation's document trail. Once as a signatory on a supply contract connected to the compound's procurement, and once, more recently, as the listed owner of a property in a coastal city that was served by 3 international airports. Emily forwarded the document to Dupree without saying anything and watched him read it on his own phone and watched his face move through the same sequence hers had. "That's where he's going," Emily said. "That's where he thinks he's going," Dupree said, and he was already on the comm with the urgency of someone who was compressing a complex operational handoff into the fewest possible words. What happened in the next 3 hours was not something Emily witnessed directly. She was in Dalton Falls, Colorado, and the events unfolded in 4 other locations simultaneously: the sublevel parking structure of the Pentagon, 2 interstate highway checkpoints in Virginia, a small regional airport in West Virginia where a chartered flight had been filed under a corporate name connected to the real estate holding company, and the parking garage of a hotel in the nearest Virginia city large enough to have a consistent surveillance blind spot in its street-level camera network. She followed it through Dupree, who relayed updates with the compression of someone who understood she had standing to know and was treating that standing as a professional courtesy rather than a concession. She sat in the conference room on Keller Ridge's administrative floor with a cup of coffee she was not drinking and her knee elevated on a second chair because the clinic had told her to keep it elevated, and she was trying to do at least some of what she was told, and she waited. Tusk was found at the regional airport in West Virginia at 8:47 p.m. He was in a vehicle registered to a subsidiary of the holding company in the departure lane of a private terminal with a passport that was not his legal name and that was good enough to have cleared a casual inspection and not good enough to have cleared the biometric screening that federal agents had arranged to be present for. He had a bag. He had a phone. He had the particular expression in the photographs that Dupree showed Emily on a secure feed 40 minutes later of a man who had believed until approximately 90 seconds before his arrest that the plan was still working. He did not look like a monster. He looked like a 61-year-old man in a good coat who had been caught doing something he had calculated he would not be caught doing, and his expression in the photographs was less fear than a kind of profound, exhausted recalibration, the face of someone whose model of the world had just been forcibly updated. Emily looked at the photographs for a long moment. She thought about Daniel Fry. She thought about 4 members of her unit and the paperwork that had labeled their deaths as accidents and filed them and moved on. She thought about 31 pages of sealed documentation that had assessed her as a liability and decided what she was allowed to know about her own service and the people she had served alongside. She handed the phone back to Dupree. "Good," she said. It was not the word she'd imagined using in the years when she'd allowed herself to imagine this, but it was the accurate word, and accuracy was what she had, and it was enough. The next 72 hours had a different texture than the 24 that had preceded them. Slower, procedural, the work of institutions beginning to process what had happened and generate the formal record that would carry it forward. Emily spent most of Sunday in a conference room at the IG's field office in Denver, which had sent a vehicle for her Saturday night because the deposition Monday morning required her to be there Sunday evening for preparation. And the preparation was conducted by two attorneys from the IG's office who asked questions with the meticulous, exhaustive thoroughness of people building something that needed to hold weight for years. She answered everything. The deposition itself lasted 9 hours over 2 days. It covered her deployment, the compound, the two incidents, Daniel Fry, her separation, the 14 months in Dalton Falls, and every decision she had made in the 24 hours beginning with the moment she walked past room 7 and stopped. The attorneys asked the same questions from different directions, the way Dupree had in the original conference room, and her answers were consistent because they were true, and the consistency was noted and documented. On Wednesday morning, the United States Attorney's Office filed federal indictments against 6 individuals: Marcus Voss, Garrett Fells, Sylvia Brandt, Colonel Raymond Tusk, and 2 defense procurement executives whose names had been in Fells's statement and whose involvement in the compound supply chain had been confirmed by the communication records and financial forensics that the investigation had been building for 2 years, and had now, with Emily's testimony and the physical evidence from Keller Ridge, converted into a prosecutable case. The filing was public. Emily was in her apartment in Dalton Falls when the notifications came through. Not on the secure tablet, which she'd returned, but on her phone, news alerts from 3 different outlets whose algorithms had concluded she was interested in this story, which was accurate in a way that the algorithm couldn't have understood. She sat on her second-hand couch with her knee wrapped and elevated on the coffee table, and she read the coverage, which was careful and sourced and attributed, and which named in each piece a former Army combat medic turned civilian nurse whose actions at a Dalton Falls hospital had initiated a chain of events that exposed a years-long conspiracy involving classified military compounds, the deaths of service members, and the attempted assassination of a senior military official. Her name was in 2 of the 3 pieces. The third used a medical professional who requested anonymity, which she had not requested, but she appreciated the instinct. Her phone ran out of storage for notifications by 11 a.m. She turned it off. She sat in the quiet of her apartment and looked at the window and the mountain visible through it, the same mountain she'd looked at from the hospital access road on Saturday evening, now in the flat gray light of a November Wednesday, with snow on the upper third of the face that hadn't been there on the weekend. She thought about all the things she had built in this apartment over 14 months. The coffee maker, the familiarity with the building's geography, the second-hand couch that was more comfortable than it looked, the routine of the floor shifts and the charge nurses who talked around her, and the patients who apologized for needing help, and the specific, habitual quiet of a life that asked very little of her, and to which she had asked very little back. She had built that life deliberately, and she had lived inside it honestly, and it had served a purpose. She knew that. She didn't regret it. But she was also honest enough with herself to recognize that the purpose it had served was maintenance. She had been maintaining herself in the way of something that was waiting for a condition to change, and the condition had changed, and the life that had been adequate to the maintenance wasn't adequate to what came next. She didn't know yet what came next. That was fine. She had operated in conditions of incomplete information her whole adult life. The absence of a clear next step was not a crisis. It was a starting position. She turned her phone back on. There were 23 missed calls, 14 text messages, and an email from Keller Ridge Medical Center's legal department that she had been deliberately not opening for 3 days. She opened it. It was 4 paragraphs long and written in the dense, careful prose of an institution that was communicating through its attorneys. The substance of it was that the hospital's legal team, in consultation with the board of directors, had conducted an urgent review of the circumstances surrounding her termination on the morning of November 8th, and had determined that the termination had been executed without adequate procedural basis, in a context where the charge nurse's report and the physician's account that had formed the basis of the HR action were now subject to federal investigation, and that the hospital was prepared to offer full reinstatement with back pay for the period of separation, a formal written apology from the institution, and expungement of the counseling record from her personnel file. It also noted in the 4th paragraph that the board had authorized the hospital's CEO to contact her personally to discuss the matter and listed a phone number. Emily read it twice. She thought about Deborah Weil and the 12-minute meeting and the piece of paper she'd signed. She thought about the HR office and the 4-minute conversation, She thought about the charge nurse at the nurses' station, who had talked about the VIP in room 7 without making eye contact, and the way the whole floor had been organized around making her invisible, and how that invisibility had ultimately been the thing that let her see what nobody else was positioned to see. She did not feel triumphant about the email. She felt something more complicated, the specific discomfort of receiving an institutional acknowledgement from an institution that had only arrived at the acknowledgement because it had been made legally uncomfortable not to, which was different from an institution that had examined itself and found something wanting. The hospital was not writing because it had decided she deserved better. It was writing because the alternative was exposure, and institutions did not change in the course of 4 days. They responded to pressure, and what she had been extended was a response to pressure, not a change. She would decide about reinstatement later, when she knew more about what later looked like. She put the phone down and went to the kitchen and made coffee with the efficiency of someone who had performed the same task enough times that it required no attention, and she stood at the kitchen window while it brewed and watched the snow on the mountain. Her doorbell rang at 2 p.m. She answered it, which she almost didn't. The past 4 days had produced a specific wariness about unexpected arrivals, and found Veltri on the other side without the federal coat, in a civilian jacket, and the expression of someone who had also spent several days in institutional processing and was on the other side of it now. "I was in the area," Veltri said. "You drove 4 hours from Denver to be in the area," Emily said. "I was in the area in a broader sense." She paused. "Can I come in?" Emily opened the door. Veltri came in and looked at the apartment with the brief, comprehensive attention of someone who was always assessing spaces without being able to turn it off. And she sat in the chair across from the couch because Emily had gestured at it, and she accepted the coffee that Emily brought from the kitchen without comment on how it tasted. "The IG's office wants to offer you a formal consulting position," Veltri said. "Medical and operational. It would involve case review, specifically cases where the intersection of military medicine and contractor networks is relevant, which is a category of case that is about to become significantly more common given what's going to come out of this prosecution." She held the coffee cup with both hands. "It's not field work. It's analysis and testimony primarily, with some site visits. It would require a security clearance reinstatement." Emily looked at her. "They're not doing you a favor," Veltri said. "I want to be clear about that. They need your specific knowledge. The compound, the logistics chain, what you know about how that network operated from the inside. There are aspects of this case and connected cases that nobody in the IG's office can reconstruct from documents alone. You were there." "I know," Emily said. "The offer comes with compensation and terms that I've been authorized to share if you want them." She paused. "You don't have to decide today." "I know that too," Emily said. They sat for a moment with the quiet that had settled between them over the past several days. Not comfortable exactly, not uncomfortable. The quiet of two people who had been through something together that had not left much room for social performance. "The Admiral," Emily said. "Recovering," Veltri said. "Transferred to Walter Reed Tuesday. His cardiologist is optimistic. The bradycardic event set him back, but the saturation was restored in time." She looked at her coffee. "He asked me to tell you something." "What?" "That he's going to appear before the Senate Armed Services Committee in 6 weeks. His testimony is going to cover the investigation, the compound, the deaths in your unit, and the command failures that allowed it to continue." She met Emily's eyes. "He said he's going to say your name, not as a detail, as the reason any of this became visible." She set down the coffee cup. "He wanted you to know that before it happened." Emily was quiet for a long moment. She thought about room 7. She thought about the color of the fluid in the IV line and the half-second of recognition and the decision that had followed it. Not a heroic decision, not a calculated one, the decision of a person who had seen something wrong and whose entire history made it impossible to look away. She thought about the fact that she had not made that decision because she was brave, or because she was good, or because she had been waiting for a moment of redemption. She had made it because she was standing in the right place with the right knowledge, and the wrong thing was happening, and she was the only person positioned to stop it, and that was the entirety of the moral calculation. It had not felt like courage. It had felt like arithmetic. That was something she understood now about the 3 years she'd spent being quiet in Dalton Falls. She had been waiting for a condition to change, but the condition that had changed was not external. She had been waiting for a moment when her knowledge would be necessary rather than inconvenient, when the thing she carried would become something the world needed to receive rather than a complication it needed to contain. The moment had arrived, and it had not looked like vindication. It had looked like a Friday night shift, and a door cracked 6 inches, and a fluid line that was the wrong color. That was how it worked, she thought. Not a ceremony, not a threshold you crossed. A crack in a door at 9:15 p.m. that you had to choose to stop for. "Tell him I'll watch the testimony," she said. Veltri nodded. She left 40 minutes later, and Emily washed the coffee cups and stood at the window again and let herself be still for a while, which was harder than it sounded. The formal proceedings began 3 weeks later. Tusk's arraignment was in a federal court in Washington, and it was covered by 8 news outlets and attended by 3 members of the Senate Armed Services Committee, 2 of whom had received briefings from the IG's office and were present with the focused attention of people who understood that what was being arraigned was not just a person, but a system that had operated within their oversight and had not been seen. The 3rd senator was there because the first 2 were there, and because appearing to care was its own form of institutional self-preservation. And Emily noted the distinction without judgment because institutions were made of people and people were complicated. She was not in Washington for the arraignment. She watched it on a news stream from her apartment in Dalton Falls, on her laptop, with the coffee maker running and her knee mostly healed and a yellow legal pad on the cushion beside her where she had been making notes for the IG consulting engagement that she had formally accepted 6 days earlier. Voss entered a guilty plea in the 3rd week of November, after his attorney reviewed the physical evidence from Room 7, the communication records, and the financial forensics that had traced his payments through 3 intermediary accounts back to the contractor network. The plea was to attempted murder, conspiracy, and espionage-related charges, and the sentencing guidelines his attorney cited in the documentation suggested a minimum of 22 years. Emily read the plea document twice and thought about him in the corridor, adjusting the IV with the economy of motion of someone performing a familiar task, and about his face when she walked past him and into the room, that brief, recalibrating calculation. And she thought that everything Voss had done had required him to believe that he was always the most important person in the room. The thing he had not been able to account for was a floor nurse who didn't want to be the most important person in the room, who had specifically built a life around being the least important person in the room, and who had therefore been standing exactly where she needed to be. Fels pled guilty in December. His cooperation agreement required full disclosure of the supply chain documentation, the financial records, and his communication history with the network over 11 years. In exchange, his sentencing was reduced to a range that his attorney described as manageable, which was the attorney's word and not Emily's, but the distinction was ultimately less important than the documentary record that Fels's cooperation produced, which named people and traced money and reconstructed a logistics network that had operated inside legitimate military procurement for years, and which became the foundation of 3 additional federal cases that were filed in the months that followed. Brandt went to trial. She exercised her right, she maintained silence through the preparation period, and then her defense strategy encountered the problem that the evidence against her was not primarily testimonial but physical and forensic. The adapters, the communication records, the biometric data from Keller Ridge's own security system showing her badge swipe into a utility corridor 3 days before the Admiral's arrival. And the jury deliberated for 11 hours and returned a verdict that covered attempted murder, impersonating a federal officer, and conspiracy, and the judge sentenced her to 31 years. Tusk's trial was the longest and the most complex, because he had the most sophisticated legal representation and the most sustained institutional defense, and because the charges against him included not only the conspiracy and the compound, but the 4 unit deaths that the IG's investigation had formally connected to his authorization, which were now being prosecuted as federal homicide charges in addition to the military justice proceedings. His attorney argued that the actions had been authorized within the scope of a classified program, that the documentation was incomplete, that the chain of command had been followed, and that his client had operated in good faith within systems that were themselves subject to the ambiguities of wartime operational necessity. The IG's office presented 31 pages of sealed documentation, financial forensics tracing payments through the contractor network, Daniel Fry's personnel file with its communications history, and Emily's testimony. She testified for 2 days. She sat in a federal courtroom in Washington in November clothes. a dark suit that she'd bought specifically for the deposition and had worn twice since. And she answered questions for 2 days with the same precision she'd brought to everything else, neither more nor less than what she knew. And she looked at Tusk when she testified because she had decided that she would look at him, and she did. And he looked back with the expression of a man who had spent 40 years in institutional environments where rank determined whose gaze you held and whose you deflected. And he was not accustomed to holding the gaze of a former staff sergeant. She held it anyway. The jury deliberated for 4 days. They found him guilty on 9 of 11 counts, including federal conspiracy, 4 counts of negligent homicide elevated to depraved indifference, and espionage-related charges stemming from the unauthorized transfer of classified compound documentation through the contractor network to the foreign diplomatic channel he had activated on the day of his arrest. The judge set sentencing for February. When the verdict came in, Emily was in Denver at the IG field office, working through the analysis on a connected contractor case that had emerged from Fels's cooperation documentation. She got the notification on her phone and read it at her desk, and sat for a moment with it in the way she had been sitting with things for months, the slow, deliberate processing of a person who had learned not to rush what needed to settle. Dupree knocked on the open door of the office. "Guilty," he said. "I know," she said. "All 9. "I know." He looked at her. "You okay?" She thought about what okay meant and whether it applied to her current state, and she thought it was approximately accurate, not precisely accurate, but approximately, which was more honest than saying yes without qualifying it. "Getting there," she said. He nodded and left her with it, which she appreciated. The sentencing in February was covered by 11 news outlets and attended by 4 members of the Senate Armed Services Committee, including the one who had come for the appearance in November, and who was now genuinely invested because the hearing had become, in the intervening months, something he could not afford to be on the wrong side of. Raymond Tusk received 63 years across the concurrent sentences on 9 counts. He would be 94 if he served all of it. He would not serve all of it because of his age and the conditions of federal sentencing, and Emily had made a decision not to spend energy calculating what she thought was just and what was achievable, because the distance between those two things was a place where a person could stand for years and not get anything done. What was achievable was 63 years on 9 counts in a federal record that would exist as long as the court system existed, and the formal military justice proceedings that were running in parallel, and that would result in the removal of his rank, his decorations, and his retirement benefits, and the public record that attached his name to the deaths of 4 service members who had deserved to die with the truth known. That was achievable. She held on to that. The memorial was the Admiral's idea. He had proposed it in his Senate testimony in late November, during a 3-hour hearing that was covered live by 2 networks, and that produced, in the final 20 minutes, a moment that was replayed a number of times afterward. The Admiral, sitting at the witness table in his uniform, looking directly at the committee and saying that the best way to honor the service members whose deaths this investigation had confirmed was to acknowledge them formally, publicly, and permanently, and to invite the person who had made that acknowledgement possible to be present when it happened. Emily found out about the invitation the way she found out about most things in this period, through Veltri, who had become something between a colleague and a person she'd eaten dinner with twice, which was not the same as a friend, but was a direction. "You don't have to go," Veltri said. "I know," Emily said. She went. The memorial was held in March at a military installation outside Washington, in a courtyard that was used for this kind of ceremony, and that had the specific quality of institutional spaces that had absorbed grief over many years and had developed a particular gravity. There were 7 names on the panel that had been installed for the occasion, the 4 from Emily's unit, and Daniel Fry, and 2 others from a connected case that the investigation had surfaced. 7 people who had died and whose deaths had been paperworked into coincidence and filed away in the institutional memory of a system that had found it convenient to forget them. The names were engraved on stone. Emily stood in her army dress uniform for the first time in 3 years. It fit differently than she remembered. Her shoulders had changed. Her posture had changed. The person who wore it now was not the same person who had taken it off 3 years ago, but the fabric was the same, and the weight of it was familiar in the way of something that had once been daily and had become commemorative. The Admiral stood beside her. He was not fully recovered. There was a quality in his movement that suggested he was compensating for something the cardiac events had left behind, a slight conservation of motion that said his cardiologist was still monitoring. But he was standing and he was present, and his expression was the expression of a man who had come to do a specific thing and was doing it. He spoke briefly. Not a speech. He had told her beforehand that he did not want to make a speech, that the names deserved more than a speech, and what he offered was direct and without the self-conscious architecture of formal address. He said the names. He said what each person had done and what had been done to them, and that the record was now accurate and would remain accurate. He said that accuracy was the only thing we owed the dead that we could actually deliver, and that it was more than it sounded. Then he turned to Emily. He held a commendation case, the formal kind, hinged, with the military seal on the lid, and he opened it and held it toward her with the directness of someone performing a ceremony without performing it, making the gesture real by not making it theatrical. Staff Sergeant Harlan, he said. Her former rank, her legal name, said without irony or sentiment, said the way it would have been said on the line every 72 hours if the voice on the other end had been someone worth trusting. She looked at the commendation. The language was formal and specific. Actions taken, lives preserved, conspiracy exposed, service members honored. And it was signed by the Secretary of the Army and countersigned by the Inspector General, and it would be part of her service record, the corrected and complete version, for as long as the record existed. She looked at the 7 names on the stone. She thought about Daniel Fry briefing his unit on a compound because he believed they deserved to understand what they might encounter. She thought about the voice on the encrypted line saying, "Your unit is the best I've deployed," and the man behind the voice and what he had been doing while he said it. She thought about a Friday night shift in a door cracked 6 inches and a decision that had not felt like a decision, that had felt like arithmetic. She thought about 3 years of being quiet and what the quiet had cost and what it had given her, and she thought that the cost and the gift were probably the same thing viewed from different angles, that the 14 months of invisibility that had made her invisible had also made her precisely and specifically useful at the moment when precisely and specifically useful was what the situation required. She took the commendation. The Admiral placed it in her hands and held them for a moment, both of his over both of hers, which was not in the ceremony protocol and which he did anyway. "Mission complete," he said. Emily looked at the stone, at the 7 names, at the quality of March light on the courtyard, the particular way it moved across stone without warming it, cold and clear and unambiguous. She thought about what came next, the IG consulting work, the connected cases. The 6 months she'd already spent learning that the network Tusk had built was larger than anyone had known, and that untangling it was going to take years and would require people who understood it from the inside. She thought about the cases she'd reviewed and the things she'd seen in them that were similar to what she'd seen in her own unit's experience, and the things that were new, and how both categories were useful in different ways. She thought about the fact that for 3 years she'd believed that what she was doing was surviving, and that surviving was not the same as living, and that the difference between the two was the question of whether you were using yourself or merely preserving yourself, and that she had been, if she was honest, doing the latter. She was not doing the latter anymore. "Complete," she said, and she meant it in the way she had not been able to mean anything for 3 years. Not as a relief, not as an ending, but as a ground. A place to stand that was solid enough to build from. The kind of solid that didn't come from the absence of difficulty, but from having gone through difficulty all the way to the other side and finding out that the other side existed. She had spent 3 years making herself small in the belief that small was safe. And what she had learned, what this particular year, with its freight of loss and exposure and the specific exhaustion of being seen when you have trained yourself not to be, was that smallness was not safety. It was just a different kind of risk. The risk of arriving at the moment that required everything you had and having spent years making sure you had nothing left. You could not predict the moment. You could not schedule it or prepare for it or know in advance what it would look like. It might look like a hospital shift or a cracked door or a fluid line that was the wrong color. It might look like nothing until it looked like everything. What you could do was stay ready. Keep the knowledge. Maintain the capacity. Don't let the weight of what you're carrying convince you that putting it down is the same as being free of it, because you carry it anyway. The question is only whether you carry it towards something or away from it. 7 names on a stone. A commendation in her hands. A case file open on a desk in a Denver field office, waiting for the kind of attention that only she could bring to it. Emily Harlan turned away from the stone and walked toward what was next. Not because she was fearless, not because the weight was gone, but because she had learned, finally, what the weight was for. And a person who knows what they're carrying and why and where they're going with it is not a person who can be made invisible by someone who simply decides not to see them. She had been invisible long enough. She was done with that now.